Welcome, everybody, to Flat Earth Nation, now known as Mud Flood was Armageddon. Don't take this the wrong way. My life is not for you, but Christ would have me love you. It is not if they will rewrite history. It is we can now watch it live before our eyes that have been opened by God. So, right now, as we speak, we're losing another war. I'm going to set up the share screen. I've got a couple of, I want to pass on what I and other people, what was our mindset in 2009, and then get into playing a video where I'm going to let a man known as David Emery talk about it. And I probably want to show Al Jazeera live because it's a podcast and I know you're going to want to watch some visuals. But while they're talking about, well, there's going to be stop and drop commentary. So thank you for joining, and let's start with a prayer. So you know how I like you to pray. Dear Heavenly Father, bless this video. And as the United States is being humbled today and losing a war, let us realize, Father, that this is all part of Satan's plan now that he is loose to deceive the nations, and that this has been a drug war on the population for a long time now. Heavenly Father, help me to prove that contention, I pray, in the name of Jesus of Nazareth. Amen. So here we go. Welcome, Luther and Tony, to not the end of the world. It says not the end of the world, but hey, so we could look at Al Jazeera first, or we could see
Hard to believe, John.
What's that, sir?
Well, I hate to admit it, but the truth is, I think we're getting soft.
that's what we used to call home entertainment for the right wing. Don't tell me we didn't call it that. I was there, man. They were propping up the Mujahideen with Rambo movies. And I think Rambo 3 was only the start. I did not know that I was going to have to be ready for Rambo the rest of my life. As things ebbed and flowed, Rambo just kept getting more and more violent. So we'll listen to the introduction. This is what I want you to hear while I find pithy things for you to listen to.
The SALT Treaty that was basically attempting to be negotiated, and it was very important at the time. This was the post-Vietnam War era. There was a revelation going on inside the Beltway that the idea that you could really just use military endlessly and solve any kind of problem anywhere in the world was really being questioned. So we were really looking at that point to a new kind of really competition with the Soviets. It was going to go from military competition much more into civilian competition. And what happened was interesting because we were working on the documentary about this issue. We were interviewing people like John Galbraith and Paul Warnke, who negotiated the treaty. Galbraith made it very clear, in fact, that at that moment in time, we really needed to reinvest in the civilian economy, that we really had reached the point of the diminishing returns. When you spend so much in the military, you actually undermine your civilian economy. So this is all part of the thinking. Well, what happened on December 27th, 1979 seemed miraculous to us. All of a sudden, the Soviets crossed the border to a neighboring country that was not considered even a part of America's interest at that point. It was not considered strategic to the United States. And it was suddenly a reason to literally turn back the clock on negotiation, on any kind of relationship with the Soviets that would reduce our spending. It seemed within a matter of days, there was the discussion had shifted from reduced arms spending and what we were going to do with that for the civilian economy, and suddenly it was how much we were going to increase the defense budget. And that really did get our attention right up front. We just wondered what could have happened. How did this happen? So the sense that some decision had been made long before the Soviets crossed the border, that feeling, that impression was very obvious. And so as we began to notice this story, the Soviets actually what happened was the Western media had gotten kicked out of Afghanistan within weeks after the Soviet invasion. And then there was a blackout. And that became our opportunity because the stories at that point were so fantastic about what was happening. It seemed that it needed a new set of eyes to look at it. So that's really what got us started on the whole process. And of course, in 30 years, what we've discovered is that there was a huge backstory that goes back, really it goes back in specifically for Afghanistan. You really have to pull the clock back into almost post-World War II. You have to pull the clock back, when the beginning of the origins of the national security state started, and the idea of an endless competition, the military competition with the Soviets was really started at that point.
You really have to look back to the British Empire. The United States inherited the obligations of the British Empire in 1947 when they partitioned India. And the center of the British Empire's global efforts centered around Afghanistan. Now, what's so very interesting about that is that the United States inherited that responsibility in 1947, but it had so many other areas of interest and influence around the world that it never really paid very much attention to it. In fact, the bureaucracy in Washington is so stolid that it never even, the old expression we have around here, dawn breaks over Marble Head. Well, it never broke over Washington until 1953 that actually the United States might have some kind of interest in Afghanistan. That was when their prime minister, Mohammed Daoud, who was the cousin of the king, King Zahir Shah, decided after having asked the United States for financial and military assistance to get some basic things done in Afghanistan, and after being rebuffed by the Dulles brothers, the Secretary of State and CIA director in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, he turned towards the Soviet Union and Nikita Khrushchev. And of course, they were very happy to supply him with the 100-bed hospital, the 50 city buses, the concrete factory so that they could pave the roads, et cetera, that they had been asking the United States to offer them. So that was the beginning. At that point, Afghanistan finally got America's attention, but it was still and remains to this day the center of this global focus on pressing into Eurasia, which was defined by people like Mackinder, the geographer Mackinder, British geographer, late 19th century, and carried into the Nazi regime with Karl Haushofer as an example.
One of the concepts that you introduced to your readers, and something that I've been talking about for years in conjunction with the wars on the Eurasian landmass in which we're currently enmeshed, and that is the concept of the Earth Island or World Island. I wonder if you could encapsulate that for us.
That whole idea came about, we refer to it as mystical imperialism. The whole idea that the British Empire, when they started out in essentially 1600, Queen Elizabeth I chartered the East India Company, which went into, bit by bit, into India, established trading posts in various parts of India, and over a period of time became a de facto ruler. It was this was the nature of combining God's will of Christianizing the world was the corporate structure. Okay, in fact, the United States, Plymouth Plantation and the plantation in Virginia were started as businesses. They weren't started as colonies that these individuals intended to populate. They were started as corporations, essentially, for the objective of creating this kind of new Earth, the new Atlantis, I believe, is what they referred to it as. You had Bacon and Milton talking about some of these things and creating this new way in which the planetary the powers of the planetary system and the stars could be invested here on the Earth and reform a corrupted nature. If you read some of John Dee's stuff as an example, Queen Elizabeth I's.
What did I tell you? Is this about to get exciting or what? It is absolutely crazy good stuff. So I see that Joel's here, Tony's here, Luther's here. Anybody that wants to come in here and interrupt anything else, we're watching the fall. Well, remember how we used to go like, oh, this endless war? Who would have thought we'd lost? And we all have, different effects just because of the tax money gone, skin in the game. But my dad had 12 siblings. I think 9 of them were brothers and 7 of them were in the military. My dad was, I was, my son was. And well, that's what happened to my son after Afghanistan, 2 tours. So this hits home hard to me. And when he's going to be talking about Francis Bacon and John Dee, it ties into everything that we have been talking about. They're the ones that, through Shakespeare added 2,000 words to our, they forced English on it so we could read John Dee and Francis Bacon. Please, let me get back to the audio visual portion of the show.
Astronomer and philosopher, you get a lot of this stuff. I mean, this is what was going on in that time period, and over time, it gradually, what Dee and what these original spiritualists evolved into was physics. A lot of the chairs that were formed in the 17th century at these various Oxford and Cambridge and these various universities in Britain, as an example, which were held by alchemists originally, are now held by physicists. Okay, so the whole idea was to translate nature, and that would be God's work. So that is at the core of what was going on in the 19th century. It began to evolve. They began to see Britain was an island nation. Well, they began to look at Russia as a land island surrounded by other lands. And when the Russians began to build railroads and began to explore into these areas and colonize and civilize, in their case, they were breaking down the tribal structure. They were bringing Western forms of civilization to these areas in Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and those southern, what eventually became the southern republics of the Soviet Union. What they were doing was seen by Britain as a great threat. They saw that what the Russians were capable of doing in this world island, which they considered to be Eurasia, that the Russians were control over, was the same thing that they had done with their naval forces on the oceans of the world from their island. So they really, a kind of philosophical panic set in right at the core of the British ruling structure and their financial structure, because that is what their trade around the world is what had made them a great power. They were just an impoverished, despite all the propaganda that we get today about the wonders of Elizabethan England and the courts and the castles and the knights and all that stuff. That's Hollywood. The fact is that as of 1600, Britain was a very, very small island nation with very much of a backward culture that had yet to really explore the world in any meaningful sense. It had to keep up with the Portuguese fleets and the Spanish fleets and the Dutch and a lot of other nations who were already ahead of them in that part of the
really colonize Afghanistan. When it was dealing with the Indian Empire, its Indian Empire, it was looking at Russia coming down and putting pressure on on the northern side of Afghanistan. It viewed that as an encroachment on its empire. So you can see the same configuration that certainly went on today between, what was the proxy war with the United States and the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union is really was a replacement for the kind of attitude that the British Empire brought to the region in the 19th century. But when they fought 3 wars, with the Afghans, they really didn't do very well. They were not able to effectively colonize Afghanistan. And what happened by the end of the 19th century was the fact, out of absolute frustration, an arbitrary line was drawn dividing Afghanistan's Pashtun homeland west from the Hindu Kush to the Indus River, and that separated, that effectively divided in half. There's something like they claim up to like 40 million Pashtuns that live on the western side. On the eastern side, and on the western side, you have something like 20 million Pashtuns that are still in Afghanistan. That's all part of these crisis areas that the Pakistanis are having such a difficult time with. Well, this line was created in 1893 by Mortimer Durrant as a solution to the fact that the British could not colonize Afghanistan. And what they did is they simply arbitrarily decided to create a sphere of influence, effectively. The British would control the eastern side of it, and the Afghans would control the western side of it. But it was never an accepted delineation to actually separate Afghanistan from its own homeland, Pashtun homeland.
Now remember that these areas that were divided on the British side of the border, this was never set up to be a democratically elected state. The area that became Pakistan in 1947 was set up as a corporation. It was set up by the East India Company and divided up by the East India Company in the 18th and 19th century in order to govern it as agencies. The company would appoint an agent to run that particular tribal area, and that agent would then be the judge and jury for that particular group of people. And he had absolute power and authority over that. So this was all kind of like a corporate manager. He was like the company manager, would come in and manage your district, your town, for the benefit and behalf of the British Empire and for the East India Company.
And that's one of the reasons why today Pakistan really, in some ways has really not matured in terms of its as a state. It has not gone through a lot of the natural growth processes.
Ahmed Rashid has even stated that the intent was to keep those agencies, those places backwards. They were forbidden from political organizing. In 1947, there was a plebiscite where the Pashtuns were supposed to vote as to where they would go, whether they would go back with Afghanistan or whether they would become an independent nation unto themselves inside with autonomy inside Pakistan. And pretty much the British government went around arresting all the Pashtun leaders and closing down the Pashtun newspapers. And the vote, of course, was something like 50.5% voted to stay inside Pakistan. So, but the problem was that the majority of the Pashtuns had been either locked up or killed or weren't able to participate in the election. So this is what Afghanistan has been protesting since 1893 when this border was implemented upon them. And it is still today the source of the problem that the United States just had to put 17,000 more troops into that area, that specific area, in order to deal with the instability that has been caused by this British decision in 1897 to keep those areas backward.
Most Americans, all they really know about Afghanistan are rugs or maybe hashish in some subcultures. But one of the things that you point out not only is that the area has a long history, but that there are many different ethnic groups whose political and social dynamics have affected what is taking place today. I'd like to sort of move into the events of the Cold War, and you've already illustrated that the United States in many ways sort of picked up the British tab in that part of the world And what had been a dynamic of the British Empire, namely the myth of the 10-foot tall Russian, then became almost a religious element of American Cold War ideology. Two of the things that you point out that set the stage for the ongoing tragedy there, one was the ascension of Team B, and in connection with that, the ascension of one Zbigniew Brzezinski. Well, explain how that impinges on the entire situation here.
Well, what you've got is the end of the Vietnam War in 1975. The defense establishment in the United States, the whole concept of the military-industrial complex, the Cold War, all of it had really spent itself. There were people within the industry itself who warned. Paul Nitz, as an example, who's considered to be the founder of the initiator of the Cold War, along with George Kennan. Kennan kind of had second thoughts about the way in which the institution was using his information. He was the same as Mr. X. And so he was fired, and Paul Nitze was brought in order to direct it. Well, Paul Nitze warned in the late 1950s, early 60s about the escalation of Vietnam. He said specifically, he's referred to, by the way, as the vicar of foreign policy. He stated that he thought that the United States would use up its war energy by going to war in Vietnam, that it was a bad idea, that our real enemy were the Russians, and that's what had to be focused on. And as a result of that, I mean, Nitze had been in there from the very beginning. He'd been in the government during World War II. A lot of these people, by the way, moved from Wall Street back and forth. Okay, you'll discover that Goldman Sachs thing comes in quite often, even with Afghanistan. So to get back to my point is that what happens is that 1975 comes along, the United States vacates Vietnam, the military and industrial complex is in a state of shock. Okay, the whole idea behind America, the American economy, the American way of making war is high technology. The United States solves problems with B-52s. When our guys overseas get into trouble, what do? They call the Predator drone guys, they call the F-16s, and they come in and they drop a 1,000-pound bomb or a 2,000-pound bomb on a village. That's the way they do it. That's our technology. Well, they're discovering today in Afghanistan that technology, of course, has the limits. You kill people that are supposed to be your friends, and they turn on you. Well, that's what happened at the end of 1975. So a group was convened. George Bush got into the White House. Of course, we just had this whole calamity with Richard Nixon. Gerald Ford is the president. George Bush is the CIA director. A group of right-wing conservatives and neoconservatives, the same as they are today, go to the president and they basically say they go to George Bush and they say, we need a special evaluation of what the Soviet Union is doing. We don't think the CIA is doing a very good job. And so, for the first time, in an unprecedented move, George Bush allowed this group, and this group was called Team B, as opposed to Team A being the standard national intelligence estimate CIA people who did the estimates of what the Soviets were up to. Well, these Team B guys come in with this ideological agenda, which is a right-wing ideological agenda with the intention of ginning up the defense budget, recreating the Cold War once again, and guess what? They discover that the entire CIA's national intelligence estimate is all wrong. All those things that you thought the Soviets weren't going to do, they are going to do. Tanks are going to come rolling down Pennsylvania Avenue any day now. But any one of these days, they're going to roll over one of their borders, and all heck is going to break loose, and that's going to be the end of the world. And it's all because the liberals are too weak on defense, and we have to do something. We have to have this enormous increase in our defense budget. So this is 1976. Well, over the next 3 years, they work on the public relations campaign. They form various groups. There's a number of people who are involved in this: Madison Avenue types, Wall Street types, defense industry people, the biggest corporations. Simultaneously, Jimmy Carter gets elected and picks Zbigniew Brzezinski as his national security advisor. Zbigniew Brzezinski is a longtime Russophobe. He hates Russia. He is a Polish exile. He believes that the Eastern Europe needs to be freed immediately, which it did. But the fact is that his intent was to do it, to use the levers of the United States government and to use Afghanistan in order to make that happen. So what happens is that from the middle of 1978, he wrestles control politically of the Directorate of Operations, which is the business end of the CIA. These are the guys who go into countries and overthrow them. He wrestles that away from Cyrus Vance and the State Department and takes control of covert operations. Well, within the next 18 months, the Soviets are invading Afghanistan. And so when we saw this happening, we said, we were doing our documentary in 1979 called The Arms Race and the Economy, talking to all these people, and we said, wait a minute, this is just too convenient. There's got to be a backstory here. There's something huge current flowing underneath the surface here. So, of course, what we did was we got involved in 1979 with our documentary, Arms Race and the Economy, go to Afghanistan in 1981, go back in 1983, only to essentially confirm our original thesis, was that these guys from Team B had managed to cook up a scenario whereby the Soviets were convinced that the United States was preparing to make a nuclear war on them, that the United States was turning back to the hardliners, and so their hardliners took over. And we over the period of time, we began to come up with all kinds of information. I mean, one of the things that was a big concern was the Shah of Iran back in the 1970s, as you recall. Okay, he was operating as America's client.
Paul, I'd like to jump in here. We are almost out of time on this side. I'd like to just point something out for the benefit of younger listeners, and then we'll continue with this on the other half-hour side of this program. The hatching of Team B and the unholy grail, so to speak, was passed from the Ford White House to the Carter White House and Citizen Brzezinski. But many of the people that younger listeners have seen on the political stage in recent years, such as Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, were part of the Ford White House and were part of this team. And of course, the George Bush who brought in Team B was the elder George Bush, for whom CIA headquarters is named, and the father of the fellow who recently and mercifully just left office. We are speaking with Paul Fitzgerald and Liz Gould, the authors of the very important recent book, Afghanistan's Untold Story, published in softcover by City Lights Books. And we're going to be returning to the narrative of just how we got stuck in this horrible mess and who the people were who helped to see to it that we got stuck there in Side 2. This concludes Side 1 of For the Record program number 678, interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Liz Gould. This is being recorded on July 5th of the year 2009. For Paul and Liz, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening.
No, is I hope the sound is still coming through. Everything's looking good here. Yeah, that thing looked like a locust or some sort of and all of those pictures were embedded in history books of the 50s. And those three colored pyramids at the top of that Pythias cult, that's how you divide and look at the hidden messages in the art. So it's getting into some pretty deep stuff. It's all about heroin, the mafia, and it is all pointing to, everything's recent. We'll see if they bring in the space program, but yeah, it's not every day that you lose a war. Afghanistan's a big thing.
Hello, my name is Dave Emery, and this is Side 2 of For the Record program number 678, interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Liz Gould. And this program is being recorded on July 5th of the year 2009. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring to our airways Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, the authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, just published in softcover by City Lights, and arguably the best and most comprehensive history of the tragic involvement of first the Soviet Union and then the United States in that country. Paul and Liz, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Thank you so much.
We're here in the Silicon Valley, and you have a website that you should be, let's mention that website to the audience, and I'm going to assume that that's one of the places where people can order the book.
Absolutely. Well, you'll get linked directly to where you can buy the book, and it's invisiblehistory.com. You can also go to citylights.com. We're certainly listed there too, and many other locations too.
All righty. And again, the title of the book, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. And because of this book, it is no longer an untold story, undertold perhaps, but no longer untold. And we're going to tell some more of it right now. Now, at the conclusion of Sod 1, we were talking about what set the stage for the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, people may recall, and younger listeners should be aware of the fact that when this happened, it was all portrayed as the 10-foot-tall Russians, the menacing Soviets beginning to gobble up the entire world by having an Afghan sandwich, so to speak. And one of the things that you point out is that there was a whole lot more to this, and that if anything, whereas we were told this was an unqualified act of Soviet aggression and a calumny and a travesty of the First Order, that really the shoe was on the other foot. You were talking about Team B and how Team B passed the unholy grail to Zbigniew Brzezinski. Perhaps encapsulate that again for us, and then explain how it is that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan.
Well, Team B really created the sort of the ideological foundation, but really in the form of a document. The Team B report really was an actual document that competed with what was referred to as Team A, which would have been the traditional way that the CIA was analyzing the Soviet threat and intentions. And Zbigniew Brzezinski gets in as President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and effectively brings in the mandate, effectively, of what the Team B analysis really was putting out, which was very much expressing its belief that the Soviets were definitely going to be crossing a border and were going to be provoking and doing things that were going to fulfill the prophecy of Team B, which was that this is an expansionist state that has to be dealt with only with military solutions. So when Zbigniew Brzezinski gets into the White House and starts to really put out the agenda, which actually included a black project that actually was signed by President Carter. This is at least what has been admitted to. Okay, and this would have been in 1978, in July of 1978. That 76 months before. 6 months. Sorry, wrong date. 1979. That President Carter had authorized a black project that allowed for the provocation, intentionally trying to draw the Soviets into what Zbigniew Brzezinski, in a later interview in 1998, referred to as the Afghan trap. That, in fact, the way Brzezinski even described it was that they were knowingly enhancing the chances that the Soviets would invade. They weren't. This was the intent of this kind of provocation. And there was also a propaganda campaign to try and put out all kinds of disinformation that would further spook the Soviets into believing that they had to invade in order to stabilize what was going on in Afghanistan. And when, in fact, the Soviets did cross the border in December of 1979, President Carter referred to that as the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. So this is the same president who 6 months earlier signed a project that allowed for this intentional provocation on the Soviet southern border. The other facts that are interesting, too, is that during that 6-month period, and even before, the Soviets were sending all kinds of signals to the United States that they were very anxious about the instability of the situation going on there. There was such concern about it. The Soviets actually expressed their desire to bring the king of Afghanistan back from exile to try and bring a stability to Afghanistan. And that was none of these ideas were taken seriously. These were ideas that got lost. And once the Soviets crossed the border, an additional piece of propaganda was put out that the Soviets were running out of oil, and that this was their first step to the Persian Gulf, and this was really what was going to be, we had to deal with this. So this allowed for an immense reorganization of the entire military-industrial complex.
So you see, at the time, I know some of your younger listeners are not unfamiliar with the idea of games. I mean, video games and the kinds of things that are done, strategy games, that sort of thing, okay? But back in the 1970s, the average American was not into that kind of gameplay. You might have had some people who played chess once in a while or on an esoteric basis or appreciated it, okay? But the whole idea of gaming another country was just so beyond the political pale that was just not something that entered into a daily discussion. Well, when you get to Afghanistan and you've got this legacy coming from the British Empire in the 19th century with redcoats marching into these areas and fighting these fierce tribal warriors up in the mountains, you've got this whole idea that got inculcated into military academies and it got inculcated into diplomatic circles. And that's what was going on in 1970s. And you've got these people like Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was a game player. And Afghanistan has been referred to as the great game. Now, the fact is that it's become kind of a cliche at this point about it being the great game. But it really is. It's a very, very sophisticated operation that was going on here. And what Brzezinski starts to do in 1978 and 1979 with his efforts is largely propaganda, but there were other covert efforts that were being done off the books by other organizations from other countries. China, as an example, was very much involved. The Chinese involvement to this day really has not been brought forward in terms of what they were doing back in the 1970s with the assistance and support of the United States in order to train Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, as an example, in areas like Xinjiang province, okay? So this is the kind of thing that was going on. And so what Brzezinski and Robert Gates, who was the deputy director of the CIA at the time, and he has admitted this as well, is that they set out to have the Soviets, to convince the Soviets that Afghanistan was going to be turned over to the United States, that there was instability there, that the United States was essentially going to go into Iran with a military force as the Shah fell, and that the so-called Marxist leader, Hafizullah Amin, would then invite the United States from Iran into Afghanistan, and the Soviet Union would have lost this very strategic border area that they were concerned about. In the meantime, there was a report that was put out in 1977 by the Central Intelligence Agency that stated that the Soviet Union was running out of oil. Now, we know today that the Soviet Union was not running out of oil. They're the number one or number two major oil suppliers to the Western world at this point. But the fact is that this was also part of this Team B idea. And what this did was to set up the situation where when the Soviets did cross their southern border, all the things that Team B had been saying about the Soviets being aggressive, that they're running out of oil. So obviously, where are they going to go? The Soviets are going to go to the Middle East because that's what their objective is. And so when the Soviets crossed that southern border, these people in the Carter administration, the Pakistanis and the Afghans, knew that they had been lured in there to protect their southern border. But that was not the way it was played on American TV. The 2 days after the invasion, the former ambassador and Richard to Afghanistan, Ted Elliott, and Richard Pipes get on the McNeil Lehrer NewsHour and sit there and say, oh, the Soviets are intent on conquering the Persian Gulf and eventually even Europe. They set the agenda right then and there. And so that was the beginning of the end for the relationship. Now, just remember that a big part of what was going on there was this idea that the United States didn't really have to do much. All they had to do was just convince the Soviets that they were doing it. And that was a big part of what was happening. The Soviets, when you read the documentation, some of which is in our book, that the Soviets from the Politburo, as an example, they were having the declassified cables coming from the Soviet side of the issue. The Soviets were sitting around in Moscow trying to figure out what was going on in Afghanistan. They just could not figure out. At one point, I think it's Kosygin, who was the deputy, I believe he was the deputy prime minister of the Soviet Union, stated, he said, it looks like a detective novel. I can't figure out what the heck they're doing down there. So this was the United States saying that this is all premeditated, that they're on their way to the Persian Gulf. And when you actually look at the documentation, you see that the Russians didn't have a clue in terms of what was going on.
By the way,
We have delivered this presentation to many groups, and in one of the presentations, one of the people who came to hear us was Charles Kogan, who is the chief of the Directorate of Operations for the CIA for South Central Asia from 79 to 84, which would have been at the time that Brzezinski was the National Security Advisor. And after we made this presentation about the true way the Soviets got drawn into Afghanistan and got held there, he stood up and basically said, what you just presented is authentic.
And so basically you have had it confirmed, I don't know about the horse's mouth, perhaps another end of the horse's anatomy, but certainly in very convincing fashion.
Absolutely.
in public.
And it's of the public record. It's actually on our website.
And he actually stated that. He said in the interest of full disclosure, he did it almost as an official act that he was doing, of cleansing his soul of this particular event. Yes, it's an act of full disclosure.
So again, for the benefit of the audience, and in particular for younger people who've only read the official history, what was presented as a club-footed act of naked aggression by the 10-foot tall Russian actually was a trap in which they were lured into this in order to fulfill an ideologized worldview which had been brought in to begin with by the very same Ford Elder George Bush team that laid the trap for them, and that was then carried forward by Zbigniew Brzezinski. By the way, that 1977 report about the Soviets was also commissioned by the Elder George Bush's Central Intelligence Agency. The Elder George Bush, just like Bush too, an oil man, just like Dick Cheney, in fact, an oil man. So what Texans refer to as the oil business we should never lose sight of how that figures into the entire situation. You alluded to Deputy Prime Minister or Deputy Soviet Premier Kosygin. One of the things that you present very in both detailed and convincing fashion is a portrayal of what the Soviets were thinking and the profound divisions in the Soviet attitude toward Afghanistan, even well into the Soviet involvement, because we, again, don't hear anything about that. Again, it's all, we see the spires of the Kremlin and the stereotypes of the stone-faced Soviet Politburo reviewing the military parades, and we don't hear anything about what was actually going on in terms of the debate, and it was vigorous, and the very real divisions that were taking place. I wonder if you would encapsulate that for us.
Well, it's very interesting to look back to the 19th century and the British, because you had a very similar thing going on between the British and the Russians in the 19th century. The aggressive forward policy conservatives in Britain would egg on the conservative czarists and monarchists in Russia, and the two would basically encourage wars with
terms that fight was deliberately sabotaged in order to embarrass the Eisenhower administration and to basically deep six the attempts at reconciliation.
Oh yeah, you see over and over. Jimmy Carter gets elected in 1976. He's going to outlaw nuclear weapons. He's going to work towards a peaceful world. If you read Cyrus Vance's autobiography as an example, he talks about the outright feud that was going on inside the Carter administration between the neoconservatives, of which Brzezinski was considered by some people to be the leader. He was a whole heck of a lot. Paul Warnke, the chief negotiator for the SALT II treaty, I asked him specifically in an interview we did with him in 1993, would you classify Brzezinski as a neoconservative? And he said, yeah, he is, but a whole heck of a lot smarter. So you see, Brzezinski is a real game player. And the thing is that, the United States, of course, is involved in this part of the world right now with its technological warfare, once again, that have already, they've used this technology again and again in various theaters of war. They used it in Vietnam. It didn't solve any problems in Vietnam. And it's not solving any problems in Afghanistan right now.
Again, you talk about some of the divisions within the Soviet establishment vis-a-vis Afghanistan, and also you've written extensively in your book about your attempts at piercing the journalistic wall of silence about Afghanistan. I wonder if you could, because we've got about 10 minutes left in this interview, I wonder if you could dovetail those for us. The divisions within the Soviet establishment, your attempts at piercing the veil of silence or propaganda, and then let's move forward to what happened basically, the Soviets will pull out, and then in a future interview, we can talk about what has happened since the Soviets moved out, because that has been an awful lot.
Well, one of the big problems that we saw from our first efforts was that the American media was completely looking at the situation in a very monolithic, us against them point of view. And so we actually went to the Soviet Union and talked with the Russians, and we discovered that because of the involvement that we were doing with our documentary, and we actually discovered that they were not monolithic in terms of their thinking. They had their own military establishment. They had their own, the KGB and these various other organs, which of course are demonized in the West as being these horrible things, were not monolithic. Actually, and Andropov, who was the KGB director and who was very much involved in the decisions before and after the invasion of Afghanistan, became became premier at one point, and early on, I believe it was 82 or 83, he became premier, and his effort was to try to end the Cold War right there and then. He decided he was going to make a shortcut, just as the way George Bush Sr. had been as the director of the CIA, and Dropoff had been the head of the KGB. And Paul Warnke even told us at one point, he said, he gets played as this kind of scary Yuri, they referred to him as, in the American media. But the fact was is that he was intent on keeping the KGB as a civilian operation away from the military. They did not want their own military-industrial complex to gain too much power, and that was always a big threat in the Soviet Union because their hawks got together with our hawks and kept the war going.
And what also happened is the whole war mentality completely morphs right into the media mentality. So what you really have in journalism is, journalism that's gone off to war too. And that's really what we came up against, was the Cold War journalism that had taken over the American media, vis-a-vis the fact that as a journalist, you really could not present the Soviets in any kind of light other than as the evil empire. And that really became a kind of mandate. And that any story that tried to present, and we really think of it more as an issue of complexity. It's not just an issue of, someone is not telling the truth and we're telling the truth. It's that their story is so simplistic. When you reduce everything down to good and evil, there isn't a lot of room for complexity. And what we keep coming up against is this very complex world that doesn't fit into this very, very dualistic good against evil paradigm. And what we were seeing throughout the entire 1980s was the stranglehold that this had on the narrative.
So what we did was, in order to our own personal effort to kind of run the blockade, if you want to call it that, of news, and this idea of this monolithic Soviet Union. After our first trip and our experience with CBS News, we did a documentary, and at the presentation of the documentary, we got a very revealing evening. Some local people hosted us at a hotel in Boston, and they invited all of the local media, the Time Magazine correspondents, and the Boston Globe people, and some international media people, and some geopoliticians as well. And the former ambassador to the Afghanistan for the United States, who was at the time the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, stood up at the end of the presentation and he said, "Who gave you permission to show this documentary?" So I questioned, I said, "I'm an American citizen. I don't need permission to show this kind of thing." He said, "Do you realize you are treading very closely to being a conduit for Soviet propaganda?" Well, Ted Elliott, the last time I had seen Ted Elliott was on the McNeil-Lehrer show with Richard Pipes, who had been the leader of the Team B project in 1976. And they were saying this was 2 days after the Soviet invasion, and these were the guys, he was one of them, who was carrying this agenda that the Soviets were on their way to the Persian Gulf. You see, which of course they weren't. We were piercing the veil at the core of where the veil was woven. And so he couldn't, the man's about 6'7", okay? I'm 5'9" on a good day. And when the world isn't on my shoulders. And it was quite an experience, and I was able to talk to the man in such a way that I managed to get a standing ovation in terms of defending my right as an American citizen to go off and do this. Well, after I got my standing ovation, Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project came up to me, and he had just come out with his book, Getting PS, which was really a bestseller, and it's still, it's 50th publication or something, printing. And he came up and he said, "Don't pay any attention to what Ted did. He's just very emotional when it comes to Afghanistan because he was there for so long." He said, "But if I can help you in any way, let me know." And I said, "Well, you can help me." I said, "How would you like to go back with me and we'll talk to the Soviets and see if we can get them out of there?" So he said, "Sounds like a great idea to me." So he said, "Do you think they'll let me?" And I said, "We can ask." So we asked. And in 1983, the Afghans said yes. Well, we got to Afghanistan. Roger was an international negotiator. He knew the Russians. He knew everybody involved in the issue. He got to Kabul. He grabs a taxi cab and goes over to the Russian embassy, to the Soviet embassy, goes inside. Their chief guide for South Central Asia comes down, and he basically tells Roger, he says, "Roger, we don't want to be here." He said, "We make mistakes, but we're not stupid." He said, "Go back to the United States. Tell them tell the media, tell Washington, give us 6 months to save face, and we'll leave the Afghans to fix this problem on their own. We don't know what to do. So Roger comes back with that.
We take that to Nightline, and basically Ted Koppel and Nightline presented the story in such a manner that there was no way that anyone watching that program would have believed there was any reason to consider even trying to figure out if it was possible to negotiate the Soviets out. And, you know, we realized at that point that there was something going on that was way beyond the obvious.
Now, let me give you a modern correlation to that. When we tried to leave Afghanistan in 1983, we went through this whole issue of censorship from the Afghan government. And I finally did get we got an agreement from the Afghans not to censor our tapes. When we went to Afghanistan in 2002, after the American involvement, we get to the airport, and as we're getting on the plane, the guy, he said, where are you? Why are you going to Afghanistan? I said, we're going to do news stories. He said, who do you work for? I said, we work for ourselves. He said, you have to work for somebody else. You have to be an authorized journalist. You have to be approved by the United States government and the Department of Homeland Security, blah, 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 blah. Now, this is the kind of thing that we could do back in 1981, 1983, throughout the 1980s, even throughout the Reagan era. We were not even questioned when we went back when we came back into the United States about the political content of the tapes that we had in our boxes, okay? It wasn't even an issue. The fact is that the customs official was more concerned as to whether we were sneaking in an Ikegami camera that we had bought overseas, and he wanted to see the registration number and make sure that we weren't sneaking in equipment that we weren't paying taxes on. He could have cared less about what was on the tape. When we came back from our trip in 2002, we get to customs, and customs says, "Where you been?" We said, "We've been to Afghanistan." He said, "Shooting pictures." He says, "Let me see them." That was the first question. And the fact is that as it turned out, you know, we didn't have anything he was interested in anyway. I pulled the camera out and I said, you know, there's nothing here that you want this to interest you. But here's a good idea of if there had been, what would he have done? If there had been images of American soldiers doing what Russian soldiers had been doing, we would have got the same censorship that we got from the Russians back in or tried to get from the Russians back in 1982 and 1983, for which, by the way, we were heavily criticized for CBS News. We were told that we only got a sanitized view of what was going on there in 1981. We weren't embedded with Soviet troops. We were simply authorized to walk around with guards, essentially, who were there to protect us from rebel attacks. But now that we do this sort of thing, it's good for us. So this is all part of the mantra that your audience, especially your younger audience, has got to realize. There was at least what we had back in the 70s and 80s, and even in the early 90s, was a freedom that you guys out there today just don't have. It's been chipped away at bit by bit by bit by bit, and our government and our leadership has been doing that, and it's like it's been happening so slowly and so gradually, you don't see it happening.
Paul, we are almost out of time here. Journalists are very much like flocks of birds. When one lands, they all land. When one flies away, they all fly away. Happily, you have broken out of the flock and presenting us with some extremely valuable truth. We've only gotten up through the Soviet involvement in Afghanistan, and your book goes all the way on up to the present, and even has a lengthy series of recommendations to President Obama. I'd like to revisit many of the points that we have yet to, I'd like to visit many of the points that we've yet to touch on in future interviews, but we are all out of time. Please tell us about your website.
Well, we have a website where you can get information, certainly about the book, and about also, we have a blog on it. We post things that we find interesting and anomalous, and, we just keep it up as much as we can. So it's invisiblehistory.com.
And we have been visiting with, and again, this is a book I can't recommend strongly enough. We have been visiting with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, the authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, just published in softcover by City Lights Books. And there's a world of history in between these covers, and listeners are strongly encouraged to get a hold of the book, read it, buy it, tell others about it. This concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 678, interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. This program is being recorded on July 5th of 2009. For Paul and Elizabeth, this is Dave Emery saying thanks for listening.
Well,
hello, my name is Dave Emery, and this is Side 1 of For the Record.
Oh, it's set on automatic because I'm on that playlist. So I'm glad to see that a lot of people are catching on and being able to follow along. Everything's going exactly as I was hoping, that we could watch the surrender of the war. I'm going to try to find some live coverage of what's going on in Kabul right now. That's the capital. And so what I'm expecting is it to be like Saigon, where they're going to have to be rescuing them, and then unfortunately leaving many of them to just die. It's bad, but I think you better brace yourself.
For program number 680. This is another interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, the authors of the book Invisible History, in the course of this interview. But in describing what actually took place in Afghanistan during and as a direct result of the trap we set for the Soviets and its aftermath, she says, and you quote on page 285, but the real Afghanistan was lacking one important ingredient. In the words of Cheryl Bernard, a RAND analyst and expert on the Middle East who was married to Zalmay Khalilzad, quote, in Afghanistan, we made a deliberate choice. At first, everyone thought there's no way to beat the Soviets. So what we have to do now is to throw the worst crazies against them that we can find. And there was a lot of collateral damage. We knew exactly who these people were and what their organizations were like, and we didn't care, she says. Again, quoting, then we allowed them to get rid of, just kill all the moderate leaders. The reason we don't have moderate leaders in Afghanistan today is because we let the nuts kill them all. They killed the leftists, the moderates, the middle of the roaders. They were just eliminated during the 1980s and afterward, unquote. Well, and in your book, you not only explain just exactly what it is that she's talking about, you flesh out the details, but you go into what led into it and what came out of it. Why don't we just briefly sum up some of the key points of our first talk and what exactly she's talking about there when she talks about setting the worst crazies in the world on them?
Well, the name Al-Qaeda itself means the base. And as it was revealed by a British politician a few years back, the base was the database from which the Central Intelligence Agency and MI6, Britain's intelligence agency, drew all the so-called crazies from all over the Muslim world. These were people who in many cases were in jail for having committed all kinds of crimes, not just political crimes, but other crimes as well. They were given a plane ticket in the Kalashnikov to Peshawar, and they were off on the jihad against the Soviet Union.
I think an important point that people need to understand is that when they hear the word Islamist, they tend to assume that there is a religious foundation that somehow is important to what is going on here, when in fact this is really an outright criminal activity. We're talking criminals here. And the fact that they might be Muslim is like, talking about various monsters around the world, whether he's a Catholic or whether he's a Jew or whether he's, a Hindu. That's not the point. It's whether he is a monster. And this is what we really need to realize about the Al-Qaeda database and what it was.
In our last interview, we talked about the importation of a group of professional defense intellectuals, a group under the name Team B, this done by the elder George Bush, who presented a radically different and more alarmist picture of the former Soviet Union. We also talked about how Zbigniew Brzezinski, a longtime professional Cold Warrior and part of the Eastern European political contingent overlapping the Third Reich that's guided an awful lot of American foreign policy for the better part of the last 100 years. And we spoke about how basically it wasn't the world-gobbling Soviet monster that stampeded into Afghanistan as part of the grand strategy of engulfing the Middle East, but rather they were deliberately lured into a trap. And one of my favorite sayings is an old Turkish proverb that says, he who tells the truth gets chased out of 9 villages. And during the closing section of our last interview, you talked about basically how you were chased out of a number of different suburbs of what McLuhan referred to as the electronic village in your attempt at telling people what was really going on, including a proposed Soviet withdrawal under Mr. Andropov. Why don't we sort of, I know that's a tall glass of water for one sitting, why don't we try to resume the story at that point, the narrative at that point, and shed light on what exactly Ms. Khalilzad is talking about, what took place in Afghanistan during the 1980s when we were liberating it from Soviet oppression, unquote.
We went to Afghanistan in 1981 for CBS News. Came back with a story, all these tapes, interviews with Barbara Kamal, who was the president of Afghanistan at the time, presented them, laid them at the feet of CBS News, and CBS News said, that's not the story. The story is Russians in Afghanistan. There's not much there. I said, well, this is what is going on in Afghanistan. This is a very complicated story. You've got women's rights issues. You've got rebels coming in over the mountains, blowing up power lines and setting mines in villages. And I said, and the local people are trying to defend themselves against this invasion. And the Barbara Kamal, the so-called Soviet-installed president of Afghanistan, stated clearly. He said the Soviet troops will go home if the United States will stop supporting the insurgency from Pakistan. It was that clear. It was very simple. Well, the guy at CBS News said, I didn't read that story in the New York Times. Then we went back in 1983 in order to hold them to their word.
When we took Roger Fisher from the Harvard Negotiation Project, we went out of our way to try to really bring what we consider to be an internationally recognized negotiator who was respected by all kinds of international entities, including the United Nations, certainly in terms of the government of the Soviet Union. He went and spoke before we even brought him there. He spoke with all of the various important parties, the Pakistanis, the Soviets. We get to Afghanistan, and Roger comes back from meeting with the Soviet expert, and he's absolutely shocked. He said they are desperate to get out. They really want to get out. He basically told me, he said, we make mistakes, Roger, but, we have to get out of Afghanistan and leave this.
He said, we make mistakes, Roger, but we're not stupid. You go back to the United States, you tell them back in the United States that, you just give us a 6-month grace period to save face, go back out of here, and then we'll let the Afghans fix this problem.
But once again, he was referring to, the insurgency is the key to understanding how the Soviets were actually kept in Afghanistan. They were basically there to support the government's war against the insurgents. Now, there was definitely a lot of confusion going on inside Afghanistan, too. And that doesn't, that's not there's no question that there's a complexity there. But in terms of the actual stated purpose for the Soviets being present in Afghanistan by the Afghan government, by Barbara Kamal, and by the Soviets, that was it, okay? Take that back, get it onto Nightline with Ted Koppel, and basically the story is presented in such a manner that Roger really ends up having to defend effectively the possibility that they might leave, when in fact the whole point of the discussion was to say it should at least be attempted. So the way in which the story was framed left the audience saying, well, there's no reason to follow this up. That's the feeling you got from watching this Nightline. And this is the kind of attitude that in 1983, we were really very curious. President Carter had labeled this, when the Soviets crossed into Afghanistan, the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War. We wondered, well, if it's the greatest threat when they crossed, wouldn't it be the greatest relief if they left? It became very obvious at that point to us that there was something about keeping the Soviets there that was very much really the operating agenda. And then you end up in 1984 with Charlie Wilson really getting the whole financing of the Mujahideen in high gear. Well, needless to say, the increased financing to the Mujahideen did exactly the opposite. It actually increased the insurgency. So therefore, the effect of Charlie Wilson's whole operation was to keep the Soviets bogged down effectively in Afghanistan for another 6 years, before they left actually of their own volition. And we now know, since they dissolved in 1991, they probably left more because they were internally in such a crisis.
One of the things that people have become familiar with in the wake of Afghanistan are some of the, the Iraq War, are some of the private national security outfits, which are assuming an increasingly larger role on the American and world national security stages. Probably the best known of those are Blackwater and Titan. In talking about the development of the circumstances which basically lured the former Soviet Union into the Afghan trap, and subsequently kept the water boiling, so to speak, again, to mix a metaphor, and particularly kept the heat up on the domestic journalistic / propaganda front. You talk about a number of private outfits overlapping intelligence services of various countries, including this one. I'd like to go through some of those. The one that we have had some discussion of before on these networks, well, other than the Enterprise, that is the Safari Club. Tell us about the Safari Club.
Well, back in the 1970s, it became very difficult for the Central Intelligence Agency to operate out in the open. What had happened was that they were caught. There was a thing called the Church Committee hearings, where the CIA was brought up on all these basically issues that they had been doing from the 1950s and 1960s, overthrowing countries, overthrowing governments, and doing all kinds of illegal things that they were not chartered to do without any oversight whatsoever. And so they got into a lot of trouble. So what happened in the mid-1970s, you had a couple of things happening. The end of the Vietnam War, which was devastating to the military-industrial complex, as well as the Pentagon and the authority. And you had these Church Committee hearings, which, as far as the intelligence community and the military was concerned, were undermining the nature of what they got to do. They needed and wanted the ability to operate in secret without really much oversight whatsoever. So what started to happen was that it became so embarrassing for the U.S. government to do these things. They started outsourcing their intelligence work. And one of the ways in which they did that was this group called the Safari Club. Now, this was begun by a number of Middle East security agencies. I think probably the Saudis were probably the most instrumental in this, Saudi intelligence. And what they did was they gathered together the Egyptians and Gaddafi's people in Libya, Saddam Hussein's people in Iraq, and the remnants of the Shah of Iran, Savak, and they put them together into kind of an ad hoc group that would go off and do things that were basically advantageous to the United States, but the United States could step back and, as they say, have credible deniability. The United States could step back and say, we didn't initiate this. And the truth is that the United States may not have initiated, but it may have been taken on as something that was just basically someone in the field said, gee, it would be great if so-and-so wasn't here any longer. And the Safari Club would organize around this sort of thing. Now, the French intelligence, Alexandre de Mélanchet, was one of the people involved in this. And he was the guy who came up with the idea of using the opium in Afghanistan to hook Russian troops. He's credited with that early on in the 1980s. But there is a lot of evidence to indicate that the entire drug operation moved when the United States was in Southeast Asia. There was a huge opportunity for these off-the-books organizations, privatized groups, in order to get involved in this. I mean, using the U.S. military as a cover, which was very easy to do. I mean, the whole situation was so out of control by 1974, 1975, that I don't think Washington had any idea in terms of what was actually happening in the field.
I mean, we ended up actually getting a contact from the London Bureau of NBC. And this would have been, 83, maybe?
Later than that.
84?
It was like 84, 85.
Okay.
Yeah.
Basically, the person called us and said, we'd like any information you have on the drugs that are coming out of Afghanistan. There's so many drugs pouring into Europe and the United States. We heard stories about drugs arriving in Boston, where we live, that were marked, for the Mujahideen. It was that overt.
Right. This particular call came from a guy in London, and he said, the London police had just arrested a bunch of guys, he said, with bricks of hashish that were stamped for the freedom fighters on it with a Kalashnikov.
There was actually a San Francisco Chronicle, I believe it was, story about again, bricks of hashish that were turning up in the Bay Area with an emblem of a Kalashnikov and also the logo.
Last time, right.
Smoke Russia away. And this was actually carried in the Chronicle. And this presumably was going to enable the successors to the Summer of Love to do their bit in the Cold War. But so a fair amount of that, some of that has come to light concerning complicity in the narcotics traffic. There are other networks that you talk about that we've never heard of, at least the listeners of this program have never heard about. You mentioned Alexandre de Mélanchet. How about the Cell Club?
Well, this is something that goes back to probably the French resistance during World War II, but there are also connections that this was an organization that was formed. There was it's interesting. The club that was very popular, and James Bond is even mentioned. If you go out and get rent the DVD for some of the original James Bond films, you've got all these guys from British intelligence, and they're all meeting at this club called the Cirque. And this is all very much an aspect of it. You've got the French intelligence, and you've got MI6 British intelligence involved in this, and they're cooking up all of these things that really is outside and off the books, away from the American experience entirely. So they're really in a position with groups like this, to be able to manufacture events in the field, especially through other groups, let's say interlocking groups like the Safari Club. They're able to actually help create events in the field that the United States then has to react to. And that's very much what led up to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. There were all kinds of things going on in Afghanistan and in Pakistan and on the Chinese border with the Chinese as an example. And what they were doing was, you had remnants of Savat, you had the Cirque, you had these individuals who were operating pretty much freewheeling throughout this area and setting up this situation by drug dealing. There's some implications that what was going on with the leader of Afghanistan, as an example, in 1977, 1978, 1979. Hafizullah Amin was very much involved with making his own way financially. I mean, if you look at, apparently, you can read the Russian documents on the Cold War History Project at Princeton, and you can read the documents that were coming out of what the Russians were saying to each other in the Kremlin about what was going on in Afghanistan, and them scratching their heads trying to figure out what was going on. Apparently, at one point, Hafizullah Amin asked one of these Soviet advisors whether he could take all the money that was in the bank account and move it to his own private bank account. I mean, it was that obvious about in terms of what was going on in Afghanistan prior to the Soviet invasion. The Soviets are sitting in the Politburo, and Dropov and all of these people, Brezhnev and Kosygin, they're scratching their heads. Kosygin says at one point, he says, "This looks like a detective novel." I mean, it's absolutely amazing. The Soviets were so out to lunch in terms of what was really going on, and they were being played by MI6, by the Cirque, and by this group of ad hoc agencies.
Well, apparently, Amin admitted to a KGB agent that he was taking money from the CIA, but he presented it that he was playing everybody, and that was just playing along.
He was confronted by the KGB at one point in 1979, and they said, "We know you're taking money from the CIA, and we know you've been seen with these people." And he goes, "Oh, I'm just playing around with them." So, I mean, this is the kind of thing that was going on during that time period. It was absolutely, it was quite bizarre. And the United States, of course, was just simply, you read Cheryl Bernard's quote. I mean, the United States basically said, look, they backed off. I mean, until the summer of 1979, actually it was earlier in 1979 that the United States actively began supporting these radical Islamists. When Zbigniew Brzezinski took over the Directorate of Operations at the National Security Council from not from Stansfield Turner, from the State Department, from Cyrus Vance, at that point, he really had control of the action arm of the CIA. And he could pretty much do whatever he wanted to do.
It's funny because
the things the CIA has been credited with, for instance, is working in tandem with Pakistan to create the Taliban, which a lot of people probably would be surprised to learn. But this is the kind of thing that was, that now is talked about, but is not really completely understood. I mean, I have a quote here from, this was a conversation that Felix Harrison had with General Zia, in the 1980s when he was still running Pakistan, to say when he was still alive, talking about General Zia spoke, this is a quote from Harrison, General Zia spoke to me about expanding Pakistan's sphere of influence to control Afghanistan, then Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan, and then Iran and Turkey, Harrison said. That design continues. General Mohammed Aziz, who was involved in that Zia plan, has been elevated now to a key position by Chief Executive General Pervez Musharraf. So this idea of what was going on when all the money was being funneled through Pakistan, that there were plans afoot through Pakistan that clearly had to do with these intelligence operations connecting to other intelligence operations in Europe and, continuing to grow.
And of course, what the center of the operations for this was the Bank of Credit Commerce International, the BCCI. And what that was doing was that was based out of London. That was pretty much MI6's idea. And what they were doing was they acted as the exchange for the Saudis, for the Saudi intelligence, for CIA, for MI6, for French intelligence. They acted as an off-the-books agency. And what they did was they banked the money. They were the ones who were responsible for the drugs and the drug trade and privatizing the drug trade and the weapons trade, which got so out of control that now we know that 93% of the world's heroin comes out of this part of the world, and nobody, for some strange reason, nobody can seem to do anything about it.
Well, it's interesting, too, when you consider the fact that when President Carter left office, he became a spokesman for BCCI. And so when you really begin to look at the lineage of Carter being the one who inaugurated this plan with Brzezinski that actually triggered the Soviets to enter Afghanistan, that then created the process that allowed the Reagan-era arms buildup that took over for the 80s to just sail through with no questions asked for the entire decade. It literally was they got anything they wanted and more.
And what's interesting, too, about it is that a lot of the aid agencies that suddenly appeared to help the poor Afghan refugees in 1981, 1982, that grew up out of this were all part of the circus. They were all coordinated out of London. There were a bunch of people that were there.
One more before we sort of take a look at some of the ramifications of this privatization of intelligence and foreign policy. One individual player I had not heard of before reading the book, and that is, I believe it's I6, another derivative of British intelligence. Tell us about I6, and then let's talk about what happens when you sort of create foreign policy and intelligence tranches, so to speak, which is kind of what they're talking about here.
MI6 is the foreign intelligence operation of British government. They're our form of central intelligence.
Right.
As opposed to MI5, which is the FBI. That's their internal security structure. MI6 has got its fingers in a lot. You've got to look back, I suppose. You have to look back to the origins of intelligence operations.
Paul, I just wanted to butt in very briefly. What I was really talking about was I6. I think it's something like the 6th International. Was a British intelligence operative was talking about I6 as opposed to MI6, or was it L6? Did I misread it?
No, it's the international.
Right.
I6.
Right.
It's the 5th International.
Well, yeah, and then while British intelligence wag, I guess, or a guy, an operative with a bad sense of humor, called this particular private outfit, I believe, I6, and this was one of the networks that was working with these other players that we've already enumerated.
Well, the interesting thing about that is that this was a breakdown of the way in which a lot of the people who had come out of the Bolshevik Revolution. This is what's so interesting about the intelligence communities and the war that we've been fighting in the West against the so-called Soviet Union, was that you had this thing called the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. And of course you had guys like Lenin who were living in New York City, Lenin and Trotsky is an example, who were living in New York City during that time period, who were basically sent back by funding from bankers in the United States to go back to the Soviet Union and help them form a government. And so you've got this kind of intrigue that goes back to prior to World War I, the development of communism. And of course, you've got state communism going on in the Soviet Union between Lenin and Trotsky. And what happens is that over time, Trotsky, who was very much integral in terms of forming this thing, winds up coming up against Stalin. Stalin is a Russian nationalist. He's actually from Georgia, but he turns out to be a nationalist. And he believes, as opposed to spreading communism around the world, what he's going to do is he's basically going to use it to reestablish the Russian Empire. Okay.
I mean, the pan-Islamist really would be much more in line with Trotsky, for instance, in terms of that philosophy, worldwide coverage.
And one of the things that we do in the book is that we show the evolution of the Trotskyite thinking. Trotsky winds up being expelled from the Soviet Union. He winds up going to Mexico, but he winds up really inspiring a lot of Western intellectuals who believed that the so-called the communist revolution, which was spelled out in their international, was had gone wrong. That Stalin had got it all wrong. That Stalin's followers were brutal. That this was not really communism, and that the Trotskyites were really going to spread this international communism. So what happens is that you've got this guy named James Burnham, who is kind of he embodies the Western idea. You know, he's educated, in the best British schools. He's involved in the United States. He's upper class American, wealthy, involved himself with Trotsky, becomes Trotsky's secretary actually, and they create this kind of hybridized version of this new way, the managerial society. Burnham kind of invents this thing called the managerial society. And what happens is that over time, Trotsky's whole idea for communism, and all these guys who were Trotskyites originally back in the 1930s and 40s, they move from spreading international communism to spreading international capitalism. So it kind of grafts itself very oddly into this kind of Frankenstein monster of this Trotskyite version of communism into free market capitalism. And that occurred during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. I mean, in a lot of ways, that was what the whole McCarthy era was all about. There were a lot of communists who were involved in this process, but they had been transformed to capitalists. So the religion became, instead of communism, became world capitalism. And they were very successful in doing that. And these are the people who were behind the neoconservatives. A lot of the origins of the neoconservatives is an example. Irving Kristol is an example, and Wallstetter. All these guys who came out of this era of the 30s and 40s ideologically transformed as they went to work for the United States government.
You might as well consider what was going on in the Soviet Union was more effectively state capitalism. And what we have in this country is basically corporate capitalism. So that's all that the switch was when they went from being Trotskyites that were, supporting international communism, and then they came in supporting international, capitalism. That was really the shift.
We're almost out of time on this side. One thought that comes to mind I'd like to explore some of the outgrowths of turning over national and intelligence policy to groups that are, although they overlap the public establishment, they're actually private groups. I was struck by the account of Hafizullah Amin being complicit with some of the CIA and Western intelligence drug traffic. I guess for that Marxist regime, at least, opium had become the religion of the people under the circumstances. So that it was a bit of a switch on the usual ideological orientation. Your website on which people can get Invisible History.
InvisibleHistory.com. That's what it is.
Alrighty, Afghanistan's Untold Story, full title, Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, co-authored by Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. Those authors are my guests, and we're going to be resuming with this discussion in side two. And we're going to talk a little bit about who's actually been carrying the flag and executing things in the name of the American people, and executing, I guess, in these circumstances, but it should be used advisedly. For Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould, this is Dave Emery saying this is the conclusion of side one of For the Record program number 680. This is being recorded on July 19th of 2009. For Paul and Elizabeth, thanks for listening. Hello, my name is Dave Emery, and this is side two of For the Record program number 680. Interview with Paul Fitzgerald and Elizabeth Gould. This program is being recorded on July 19th of the year 2009. Once again, it is my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves, let's do Elizabeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald, the co-authors of the book Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story, a remarkable new title that's been published in softcover by City Lights Books. Elizabeth and Paul, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Dave.
We've been talking about some of the private networks that were involved with the development of the first phase of the Afghan wars, the phase of the Soviet involvement in those. Between the two recording sides here, we were talking about some of the complexities. I brought up the I-6 network. And one of the things that I think listeners should be advised to do is use these interviews as a jumping off point to read and ideally buy the book, because some of the philosophical and operational elements here might seem really difficult. For example, if talking about the history of Trotskyite philosophy, how that could morph into doctrinaire anti-communism, how that would relate to some of the venal elements, some of the recruiters of what Cheryl Bernard called the crazies that we turned loose on Afghanistan in the 80s. Again, read the book, because it might seem like an awfully long jump from talking about Trotskyites to people like Albert Wohlstetter and some of the Team B members and the neocons, but actually the philosophical and practical evolution is there, and if it isn't immediately transparent for listeners, get the book, and we're going to tell you how to do that at the end. Now, one of the things you guys point out, one of the things that was derivative of using these private networks, one of the things that was derivative of just a not particularly intelligent foreign policy crafted for one purpose only, which was to get the Soviets, that was that a lot of private players, a lot of the quote allies, unquote, and listeners should note the quotes, some of the various vehicles that were used to realize the Safari Club's war, Charlie Wilson's war, the Enterprise's war, I-6's war, what have you. This had the result of sort of an incoherent foreign policy. Individuals and institutions began pursuing their own goals, so that when people talk about American policy in Afghanistan, past or present or perhaps future, it's not just American policy. How do all these individual players and how does the privatization of this sort of thing actually work out when one examines what has taken place in the event?
Well, I mean, you have to look at the origins of these organizations. You have to look back to the origin of the Cold War and the kind of fact that we have this kind of separate government that operates behind the scenes with the creation of the National Security State in 1947. And people go about their daily lives and, interact with it in ways they don't really understand. I mean, this group of people really has very little, there's very little oversight over this community. And this was expressed by Dwight Eisenhower back in the 1950s. He said, we're embarking on this huge process. He referred to it as the military-industrial complex, but it's actually more than just military and industry. It's academia, it's the media, and as we have deindustrialized as a country, we have narrowed our focus into putting a lot of our energy, a lot of our brains, a lot of our best abilities into this thing called the military, industrial, academic, media union. And so as a result of that, you've got bit by bit, what's happened is that it's become more and more a part of our lives that we don't know about. People
get an effect.
Yeah, you get an effect, you see the effect, you see the impact of their policies, either here at home or overseas, but you don't know who's really behind those things happening.
You see, that's exactly what happened when we witnessed the effect of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It wasn't so much that we were surprised that there was a response, but it was clearly a response that went way over the top when you looked at the facts on the ground. You had what was supposed to be a very, very insignificant country, the way it was presented by the American media, that was in the Soviet sphere of influence and historically has always been labeled that. This is a neighboring country where you have an uprising. There seemed to be something that was so out of alignment. But the other feeling that was very obvious, the other observation that was very obvious was that you realized that you felt as if there had been a complete agenda delivered that had been discussed somewhere by someone for a very long time, and it was served up to the public. And then the media just puts it out as if, it's a new twist on what's happening, but it really is the finale of something. So that kind of clued us into this sort of sense of this other kind of, I think it's called the fourth estate, the idea that there are other activities going on, and they somehow burble to the surface, and that's how we become aware of them. And when you actually butt up against it, and we did it as a story, we came up against it through our interaction with the media. We saw it at CBS, the way they were cutting the story. We saw it at ABC, the way they were cutting the story. And so you begin to realize that this process, it may have a very secretive core that we don't even know who their names are, but there are a lot of well-known people who are somehow helping this process along and are participating in it. Now, whether they're doing it with directives that actually are written out, or whether it's some kind of subliminal.
Well, we knew, for example, I have personal experience with CBS News in 1981 when we came back with those tapes. They sat with those tapes for 4 weeks trying to put a story together. And, I finally called CBS News and I said, "Where's the story? What are you going to do with this?" They interviewed me, they had me on camera, And they said, the woman we were working with, the producer said, I wish I had never heard the term Afghanistan. I have been getting phone calls from every executive at CBS to make sure that this is crafted correctly. And that was something, I don't even know if there's going to be a story that's going to air.
We were actually told by people we were working with at ABC that they had been contacted by, I think it was Freedom House, about the fact that why ABC allowed our footage from Afghanistan to be shown. So here you have Freedom House challenging the production people inside ABC about airing what we saw in Afghanistan, and obviously believing that they had a right to do that.
So the official pressure and the semi-official pressure that was being put on the news media to talk about Afghanistan, I think in a lot of cases, as you stated in the book, I think a lot of news executives just simply said, look, this is too complicated. We're not going to deal with it.
By the way, in passing, there's a book authored by Christopher Simpson that we've discussed on these airs. It's called The Science of Coercion, and it's Communications Research and Psychological Warfare, 1945 to 1960. One of the points he makes is that in the intelligence community, the defense intellectual media establishment is so profound that U.S. Cold War intelligence policy and communications research are so overlapping as to be past the point indistinguishable in this country. It sounds like to an extent what you were fencing with was that very same nexus.
Absolutely.
Oh, there's no question about it. I mean, we live in the Boston area, so we get a lot of intermix here between so-called military-industrial complex. You've got MIT, you've got Draper Labs right down the street from MIT. Charles Stark Draper was the guy who said back in the 1950s, give me enough time and money, and I'll put a missile through Khrushchev's bathroom window. Well, that was all connected to this whole effort to try to come up with a way to fight limited nuclear wars. I mean, and so you've got the nuclear industry, you've got the weapons industry, and what was going on back, of course, after World War II and the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you had this concept called mutual assured destruction, which basically stated that once each side has got so many weapons, you can't use them any longer because they'll annihilate you and you will annihilate them with each of your weapons. So they cancel each other out. So what was coming on was these neoconservatives were coming up with these new ones.
So that is basically, just to check in here, that is basically the summary of everything I've been trying to teach, is that ever since that time, right after World War II, Korea, when, China really made its stand, that's when everything was rewritten up to that point. And it's been Afghanistan this and Afghanistan that, but it's basically the same crew because there are no nuclear weapons. They're all in on it. You get it? This is from 2009. These are the people that we were listening to back then. We knew something was going on, but there was no veil lifted. And as I look back at it, when I joined the Army, it was in 1979. I didn't enter until 1980 because there's only so many spots at certain schools, and the surveyor school didn't open up for 5 or 6 months, so I chose to wait to try for that instead of just joining. But anyway, my son also joined in this Afghanistan thing, 2 tours in a spy plane, not doing drone stuff. I'm not saying, they can't say what it was, but, there's ways that even without the battery in it, they can still hear your voice. And now the reason that, they don't need people like my son anymore is because they have computer chips that can do it. And that's what it's going to do. No, the news clips are from today, Edna. Thank you for letting me point that out. No, we really are losing the war this weekend. It's not like a tie. It's not like an armistice. It's like us leaving Saigon. We're going to be running from the rooftops very soon. So, and this is the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and it's right before September. And wow, 20 years is not even a whole generation. So, man, oh man, no, it's It's happening now, today, and there are going to be repercussions. I just wanted to get the news clips live in case we ever need to look back at them, because they're probably going to scrub this story too.
Ideas, these wild new ideas, justified by the just war doctrine of the Catholic Church. This is what we saw in 1980, that you could actually fight nuclear wars by using these new kinds of things, regardless of what happened. Afghanistan made a lot of these things possible, and it happened covertly. Suddenly, we are on the scene, evidence of the Soviet presence in Afghanistan. The official line was that they're driving to the Persian Gulf to get our oil in the Persian Gulf, and therefore we have to do everything in our power to stop them. And that's what Charlie Wilson's war is. That's the cover story. The real story, of course, as we know, is something else entirely.
Well, there's a chapter, a short chapter we have in the book called mystical imperialism, and I think that what we're really sort of talking around right now is really very much connected to that 19th century concept that really was an attempt to explain the power that an individual takes in the form of king, president. In this case, apparently it was coined for Cecil Rhodes, and his desire to Christianize Africa, and his belief that this was his duty and obligation. And I think that we have a modern, examples of that. We felt that, in witnessing the way in which Zbigniew Brzezinski was able to orchestrate the use of the various elements that had been created by the national security state for his own personal objective, which was to specifically undermine the Soviet Union and free Poland. And he did it by basically, apparently, without much, I guess, concern for the Afghan people, signing on to the idea of drawing the Soviets into Afghanistan and using the land of Afghanistan for the place to destroy the Soviet Union. Well, in my understanding, I think that would be a modern version of the practice of mystical imperialism. And it's certainly summed up. I have here a quote this is Lawrence of Arabia from the Seven Pillars of Wisdom. And I think this is a way to begin to grasp the kind of thinking that could produce this type of result. Quote, those who dream by night wake in the day to find that it was vanity. But the dreamer of the day are dangerous men, for they may act their dream with open eyes to make it possible. You see, it's as if, and that's the end of the quote. It relates in the sense that what we're looking at today is effectively how an individual can bring what they believe is what they need to do and convince other people to go along with them. And what you discover is as you begin to reach a point, now what happened with the end of the Cold War, this is probably the most impressive modern example. Many people really signed on to the Cold War and the national security state because they absolutely accepted the fundamental idea the Soviet Union was an absolutely dangerous state and that there was nothing short of doing everything that we had to do to protect ourselves. Well, the Cold War ends, and a lot of people are looking around and saying, where's the peace dividend? Where's the payoff for all of the 50, 60 years of this, of this investment? And they realize, wait a minute, it's not over. It just it morphed into the next generation. So this is when you realize you were caught up in someone else's dream. But for them, for the ones who are still pulling it along, now it's Muslim extremists. It's Al Qaeda. There's always going to be something. They're never going to stop.
And I really think there's a lot of people inside the institution who are aware of the fact that we're on a train ride and with the train's out of control. I mean, Milt Bearden said in an interview a couple of years ago. Milt Bearden is the ex-CIA guy who ran the operation during the 1980s from Pakistan under William Casey from 84, I believe, until 89. The Soviets left. And he said, it's out of control. He said, now we're just caught up in this whole idea. We're moving from war to war. He said, there's no reflection on why we're even doing it.
He's a good example, by the way, of someone who accepted the idea that the Cold War was justifiable to him. And anything we had to do to the Soviets was justifiable. But when the Cold War ended, he's one of those people who stepped out of whatever that miasma was.
And woke up.
Exactly.
One of the things that after the Soviets left, obviously, it wasn't the end of the difficulty. If anything, things over the long haul may have gotten worse. Obviously, the United States has thousands of troops. Other countries have smaller numbers in Afghanistan fighting Taliban and Al-Qaeda related elements, some of which are based in some of the tribal territories in Pakistan, whose genesis we talked about in our last interview and discussion of the Durand Line. But how did we get from there to here? And in particular, one of the points that you made, and we've already touched on it, but that what we in this country say are presented with as American foreign policy is not necessarily American. It isn't even what is being generated in Washington, Langley, or whatever. The role of private players, and before leaving that subject, if you could detail for us one of the more astounding of the little bomblets from this literary cluster bomb. You talk about in the late 70s when Bill Clinton was president, and elements of the military dispatched U.S. Special Forces to begin training Pakistani Special Forces in techniques which were ultimately going to be put directly to work for Al-Qaeda / Taliban, etc. And the Clinton administration knew nothing about this.
Right. This was in the late 90s.
Right.
Yeah, and the administration, JSETs, I think they're called, there was a special program that the Pentagon had with the Pakistani military where they would go in and they would train them in these advanced terrorist techniques, and that's all they were. And they were training them at a lake that was near the border with India. Of course, as I'm sure your audience knows, there's been a constant conflict between Pakistan. Their big issue, Pakistan's big issue, is this line of control in Kashmir between India, this contentious area in India between India and Pakistan. And so, as a result, anything that you train the Pakistani armed forces for, it is well known that they are going to utilize it. They're going to use the money, they're going to use the training in order to overcome whatever resistance they're fighting in the state of India. And so this is what was going on. It was not a private group. This was a government group, came out of the Pentagon, were training these Pakistani commandos in terrorist techniques, how to blow up towers, how to do whatever terrorists need to do under the circumstances. And it was completely unknown to the White House. And when the White House was confronted with this program, the White House was completely clueless. Bill Clinton's people just simply, they hemmed and hawed, and they sat back, and I believe it was Secretary of Defense Cohen finally just simply issued a statement that the program was completely fine, and there was nothing wrong with it, and it was a very necessary part of defending the United States. It was a very terse statement, but it indicated it was revelatory of something that we've seen over and over again, is that the American government is not a monolithic thing. There's all kinds of people who've got in at various levels of our government and who are operating the levers of power without the knowledge of their superiors, but are acting as what they're referred to the term as dining out. They're dining out on the American public, and they're dining out on the American name and the American government. And as a result of that, they can make things happen. It doesn't take a lot of people to make something happen in the world.
We know right now that Goldman Sachs has been labeled as making a lot of bubbles happen. So the idea that these entities can make things happen and force the United States to have to respond is pretty well documented in all kinds of areas.
And not only that, when you've got the kind of issues where you've got people who are given so much authority in the field and a lot of money, suitcases full of money, you can do pretty much in a place like Afghanistan. Individual actors have a lot of power over there. You can go over, you can hire people. If you've got the money, you can make your own little private army and do pretty much whatever you want to do. Set up offshore accounts, do anything you want to do if you're inclined to do so.
That's now. That certainly wasn't the way it was.
No, that's what's happened since the war in the 1980s, and that was what was facilitated
by breakdown of civil society.
Yeah, you don't have any governmental authority that's looking in over the situation and saying, hey, you can't do this. The police will come in and arrest you because it's all been privatized.
During the hiatus between the end, or hiatus is the wrong word, but in the period between the Soviet withdrawal and September 11th and the formal involvement of U.S. combat forces in Afghanistan, a great many things were taking place. Some of these private actors and networks were doing their thing, so to speak, in Afghanistan. And fossil fuels, or what is known in Texas as the business, figures in a lot of this. In that period, in that historical gap between the Soviet and American involvements, tell us about Unocal and how basically people were pouring trouble on oiled waters, so to speak.
Well, I mean, Unical, wanted to put a pipeline in. And this was something that had been going on for years. I mean, if you look back at the foreign policy, I mean, the whole quest towards Eurasia, this is part of what was going on in the late 19th century with Britain. They were moving up into that area. The Caspian Basin was a very coveted part. In fact, I believe Hitler's troops were headed towards Stalingrad during that time period. They want to seal off Stalingrad and get down into the Caspian so that they could seize this vast oil reserve. And this has been a motivation in Western politics and in the Western world for a century. And so this is what was going on. When the Soviets vacated the area, they lost their ability to control that militarily. And that's when the United States started moving into the former Soviet southern republics, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan. And somebody wanted to put a pipeline in there. And Unical, it was Britas wanted to put in, it was an Argentine company, wanted to put a pipeline in. And they went to the Pakistani government and they said, we'd like to do this, but they didn't have the funding. The war was still going on. But Pakistan said, fine, we'll help you do that in any way we can. And then Unical came in. Unical came in and they said, they told the U.S. government, we don't want Britas in there anymore. So they essentially had the American diplomat in Pakistan telling Benazir Bhutto, kick Britas out. This is our game. And Bhutto was very upset by that at the time. I mean, this was a straight-out case where the United States was basically informing a sovereign nation that they couldn't do business with this other guy. They had to do business with this American company. And so
when you add in, of course, the Clinton administration was busily working to try and recognize the Taliban. That was one of the keys to the deal with Unical being able to actually go through. And you have to remember, when you look back and you realize that Pakistanis created the Taliban with the intent of being able to install a Pakistani-friendly government in Afghanistan. And that was all part of the conclusion of this, was by recognizing the Taliban, and that legitimacy would allow the deal to go through. And the only reason that the Clinton administration did not recognize the Taliban was because simultaneously, while the deal was being pushed through, the feminist majority had been putting out a huge campaign trying to expose the fact that the Taliban actually were effectively perpetrating gender apartheid on Afghan women. And that sort of took over, and so the Clinton administration was effectively embarrassed out of being able to sign the deal.
So the Clinton administration's foreign policy was really a privatized foreign policy, which was involved with trying to help Unical get this pipeline through. And so, Unical went and hired Zalmi Khalilzad and all these people, William Oakley and all these different individuals who had worked in the previous administration, brought them on as consultants to get this thing going. Robin Rafel, the former U.S. ambassador's wife, was brought in as well as a consultant, and she was brought in directly. She was working for the United States government and directly trying to get the pipeline passed, built, and was trying to get the United States government to actually recognize the Taliban. And what finally happened was that Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright finally got enough lecturing, I guess, from the feminist majority to finally sit back and look at the situation and say, wait a minute, this is so crazy. We can't let this happen. But what's disturbing about that is that those same forces are back in the game right now. In fact, the game is even bigger than it was 10 years ago. And you've got all kinds of pipeline deals. There was one just announced the other day, the Nabucco pipeline deal. We haven't even solved our issues politically with Iran yet. But this whole Nabucco pipeline deal, which was very contentious to begin with, it's been percolating for some time. The idea is to take gas and route it anywhere but through the Soviet Union, through Russia, the former Soviet Union, anywhere outside that and back to a terminal in Austria for distribution across Europe. In other words, to cut Gazprom, to cut the Russian oil and gas giant out of the European market. And so this has been the objective from the very beginning. And apparently something came through just the other day. It's been really very a contentious issue. People really didn't think that this could possibly be done because Iran, of course, is at odds with the United States. The whole issue of their nuclear program is upsetting a lot of people in a lot of places. And suddenly, there's an announcement that Iran is going to be supplying all of this for the Nabucco pipeline. They're going to be the major supplier for the Nabucco pipeline, which is now being considered a coup for the United States because it locks Russia out of the energy deal.
And that brings us to the real issue. It really has to do with the old Cold Warriors that sort of from the 1940s on attitude, the Cold Warriors that were embraced as the national security state against the Soviet Union. Well, there's a lot of Cold Warriors and a lot of Cold War thinking that really is applying the exact same idea to Russia. So you begin to realize that the whole anti-communist thing is actually now been revealed as an anti-Russian thing. And when you look at the history in the 19th century and the whole battle that was going on between the Russian Empire and the British Empire, you see the exact same paradigm. But I think we all really have to, at least acknowledge one thing. We're talking about Russia's neighborhood. We're talking about this is where they live. And here you have the British Empire in the 19th century coming in and basically, deciding it should have more sway in Russia's neighborhood. And you sort of have that same effect now. And Brzezinski seems to be the point man once again. He's absolutely still carrying his agenda, his Russophobic agenda, and he's talking very much into Obama's ear. He's probably one of the key people who would like to see, the Russians completely cut out of any kind of, normalized.
Uh-oh. I guess I just got a message that the sound is way off. So I was just wondering, were you guys able to hear that? So how are you guys doing? I mean, I'll put in a link here. If anybody wants to come in and talk about what they think of the United States losing the war now. It was one thing to kind of like laugh off at first the endless war bumper stickers, but now that it's not endless, it's over. We lost. If anybody wants to share with that, especially somebody that was like an adult when it happened and things like that, that 9/11. So that was my attempt, because it's always been the Muslim against the Jew, and then now, the mythical third temple that has to be built on top of the dome of the rock. Oh no, and don't forget, you're supposed to be afraid of nuclear weapons also. In the back of your mind, something else that doesn't really exist. So this is all part of a setup. Things are doing really good. Tommy has a lot of things going on. We were going to, be busy tomorrow, but I just, how many times does a war end? I mean, I remember when they were evacuating them off the roof in Vietnam, Saigon, and just everything went away. Now we're going to have to, were we ever really winning? Were we planning on winning? Oh yeah, I was playing a video, of what's happening live today. And I'm playing the background music to a video from 2009. So yeah, this basically is just a good chance for probably another hour or so, and that'll give me enough time to do a theological show tonight. But yeah, this basically is just going to be on the record, moment by moment, when you see the United States isn't going to get a chance to hand off power in September 11th. The Taliban are forcing the issue without any problem. Amy, all you have to do is just push the audio and take off your camera, and it'll show a thumbnail. You can get that all set up if you do want to try to come on. About your age, Scotty, anybody that would have remembered as an adult 9/11. Yeah, Tony, you fit that description. You can bring your radio voice on here. Wait, Scotty, are you kidding? Have you never seen Amy? She's like very far from ugly. She's just, the word for that is facetious. She is being facetious. So if nobody wants to come on, we'll give it a few minutes. Let me see. Is there a song that kind of sums up that whole era? 1980s Patriot. Music. Patriot music. We better do it this way right now because we're riding on, no strikes, but it's a couple of warnings. What's this? Where'd all the music go? Hold on to your hats, everybody. Here comes your rock and roll music.
These days you can't get a man to work. People getting married and they still flirt. Don't pledge allegiance to our flag like we used to do. Men willing to give their lives. Our politicians take away our rights, saying they know best what's good for you. These days dads are always gone. Mama's still ponytail hair, but she's on her phone. Grandma's raising the kids, and the devil is too. If you ask me, this whole world is gone to hell. I speak the truth, but these days the truth won't sell. I'll leave red, white, blue, and nowadays you just can't change. Wrong or right, I give my life. This place called USA. I'd rather live with my wife and teach my kids about the land of the free and the home of the brave. I'm sick and tired of people putting it down. If you don't like it here, get the heck out of town. Go and find somewhere you love. It's fine with me. We don't need people riding the fence. You're either riding with us or you're riding with them. Make up your mind which side you stand. If you ask me, this whole world is gone to hell. I speak the truth, but these days the truth won't sell. I'll leave red, white, blue, and nowadays you just can't change. Wrong or right, I give my life. This place called USA. From the thin blue line to the men who died, there's a freedom calls on the brave. Where they gave their lives for this place called USA. If you ask me, this whole world is gone to hell. I speak the truth, but these days the truth won't sell. I'll leave red, white, blue, and nowadays you just can't change. Wrong or right, I give my life. This place called USA. Wrong or right, I give my life. This place called USA.
Every road has its challenges.
Of
We
relations
say,
in the United States. This whole, this world situation, of course, is now focused around this particular area, given the fact that the United States economy there's a lot of questions about the leadership of the United States, of the world economy by the United States, and whether the world will continue to trade in dollars, as an example. You have the BRIC economies, the Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And recently, one of these international meetings, Brazil and China agreed to trade with each other with their own currencies, not in American currency, not in the dollar. So these are the kinds of things that are beginning to develop. So we're really looking at we're looking at the beginning of an era, and I'm really getting the impression something's going to have to give here, very sooner or later. Russia has already been, NATO was not dissolved at the end of the Cold War. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved, but not NATO. The policy of the United States has been to bring the former Soviet Union, bring Russia and these old Eastern European countries and towards their southern border with an anti-ballistic missile shield. This is not fooling the Russians. I mean, it may be good PR for the United States, but it's not fooling the Russians. They're looking at this situation as very threatening to their existence. At which point, this is the question, at which point is both China and Russia going to look at the United States, the number of bases that they're building, the kind of policies that they're taking, building oil pipelines around and through their competition so that they can choke off either Russia and China. At what point are they going to say, wait a minute, you're not going to do this to us anymore? And what is going to happen when they do that? Okay, because that's what we're headed to. This is a very similar time period to where we were in 1979 in the lead up to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviets looked at the situation coming out of the Carter administration. They looked at Zbigniew Brzezinski and his history, and they said, we know who this guy is. We know what his intents are. There is absolutely no point in negotiating with the United States under the circumstances because we got nothing to lose by going into Afghanistan. We're in a very similar situation right now with these kinds of things. If the United States pushes this thing too far, if in China, which holds an enormous amount of U.S. debt, the note on an enormous amount of U.S. debt, and a lot of their accounts are in dollars.
That's how you do it? Was it not sharing? Oh, you have to turn off the other link to the video and just be on your phone or one at a time. So there it was for a little while not sharing, but
Maybe.
there, I heard myself.
You have terrible sound. It's like a choppy sound. It's terrible.
Oh man, was it the chipmunk thing? Well, that might just be my signal that I got enough about the end of the war, and I can get on with my day now. But yeah,
Better. That should be better. Hey guys, how are y'all doing?
how are you? And how's Terry? How's things holding on there in Navasota?
Yeah, we're doing good. They're good. Animals are good. All is good.
Did you see there was another big earthquake in Haiti? That's never good.
Oh, that is too bad. God bless them.
7.2, 150 times greater.
7.2, another big one.
Wow.
And so whether or not it's real, they're going to be collecting money and blood for it. You know that.
We've been watching this on Afghanistan all morning. I think all of us just want to get your insight, Paco. What does this mean for prophecy or where we're at? How does this affect the saints, the camp of the saints? You brought it to
I think that it's time, and the main thing it's going to be is there's going to be a lot less puffy chested ex-veterans, going around, you won't know, you weren't there. This is how you lose. And when people start comparing it to, you just fought 20 years and lost less than 3,000 men. And they used to do that in one ship accident, in some of the world wars. And I'm not diminishing any of those deaths. It could have been my son and his 2 tours to Afghanistan.
That's not the number they gave earlier on the news clip that we were watching with you. They had put a number much higher than that. Are you saying that these numbers are inflated?
Or what? How many are these? I know it's just, if anything, it wasn't Iran and Afghanistan or Iraq and Afghanistan less than 3,500 for, total killed in action.
You would know more than I would on that. What does this mean?
It's right around that number. Yeah. It's not what you would think, like, even the Vietnam War is ghastly, but that was, I think, 56,000, and it lasted about 12 to 13 years. So I'm not comparing death, but I'm just saying we have a lot less threshold for suffering today without making it news. But one of the things, if you missed earlier, one of the books that they were talking about, those authors, was how now you get, after Vietnam, now it's free to make cocaine there all you want, and now after what's going to be Afghanistan and Iraq, there's plenty of heroin coming out of Afghanistan. It's all set to grow, and the United States is 19 to 53 to 73, depend on what you want to believe, $1 trillion in debt. So, did you turn off your volume?
No, I did not. Can you
Now,
hear
what do
me?
you think of that? I was just going to make sure because you seem kind of far away.
I am kind of far away. Okay. I'm just trying to work out this for the 11 people watching. Just trying to work out. Okay, there. I'm hearing what you're saying. I'm just taking it all in.
All our life, it's been about the same hoax. Because when you're talking about Afghanistan, Iraq, it's all terrorists. It was the Iranian hostage situation, all built on what?
Well, that's kind of what I'm asking you.
Okay, well, yeah, that was kind of rhetorical, but I needed to give you more of a lead in. What I
Okay.
would say is,
One of my
hey,
dear,
hey, Amy, have you ever heard of a petrodollar?
hang on a second now. One of my very dear friends, I'd like for you to meet him, has
Okay.
just pulled up. It'll be a short, brief conversation. Hang on.
Yeah, ask him if he's ever heard of a petrodollar,
He's not.
because that's what it's all about. And then in 1970, they had the end of the Bretton Woods agreements, and it became fiat money in the United States. And then so everybody in the United States, or not, I mean, everybody on the whole surface of God's flat earth started accepting petrodollars and trading oil in petrodollars. And watch out for carburetors that give 65 miles to the gallon. That's like the cheese, and no Gouda to the people who want to make the money off of oil. And one thing that it's pipelines, because that's what they want. Maybe they need it because maybe they don't know where they are in history, or they just need them for their deep underground bunkers. Something's going on where they're planning on, they just don't care about the surface of the earth as much as I would think normal people should care about the surface of the earth. So here comes Amy. I could hear them talking. Amy, I just had a good rehearsal
What's up?
for all of this that's going on, except I don't want to do what we did rehearse, but it's all about oil. It's all about pipelines. It all comes down to 1970 and the petrodollars. You remember what they were?
I wasn't born in 1970, Alan.
Oh, but do you remember the history? I was looking for people born in 2001, but in 1970, of which I remember very well, that's when the United States had to admit that it didn't have the gold and silver to back our currency, but they announced petrodollars. And so everybody started trading with their new friends, Saudi Arabia and the United States and England, because BP is basically British petroleum. It's all government. Shell is the Dutch, and it's all how the mob is sharing oil that they basically get for free and sell for, $100 a barrel, and then make everything from Maybelline eyelash extender to what burns in your car. So
Don't
that
forget,
all happened in 1970. And right after that, that is when Nixon resigned. He waited. The way all of the post Bretton Woods agreements, that's what they were called. When they ran their course in America, it had to admit to the world that it's all going to be fiat dollars from here on out. They had to wait for the last normally elected president, but it was still a fix, and that's Nixon. So they had to, one, as soon as they started a trial in 71 to get rid of Spiro Agnew, who was Nixon's vice president. Now, remember, you asked. So vice president's gone, and they appoint Gerald Ford, the head of or one of the people as a freshman congressman, I think, to the Warren Commission investigating JFK. Now he's vice president. And so then they announced, oh no, you've been discovered, Watergate. Oh, I'm not a crook, I resign. An unelected person is now president. He appoints David Rockefeller as his vice president. And the next thing you know, they form a cartel, an OPEC cartel, and they bump up the price. They quit pumping oil and they cause an oil shortage. And then, doggone it, they just did that because there's Muslims, and the bin Ladens are ass deep in the situation from the beginning. So that's how it all ties in, is because it's all part of Satan being loosed. The Muslims against the Jews from the very beginning. Both of them are made up in their current form of religion and or geographical centers. That was fun.
That was very interesting, especially the last thing you said. I mean, would you like to elaborate on that? It's something I've wanted to hear you elaborate on. You said that both the Muslim and the Jews are made up and have been since when?
Have you ever heard of the court Jew?
Tell me about the court Jew, Alan.
Oh, let's just look it up, man. This is fun, huh?
This is fun.
We got to make sure we'll go to where Creed Fisher is. We'll just type in court Jew. This will just be very rudimentary Wikipedia type of deal, okay?
Yep.
In the early modern period, read starting in 1711, our known history. A court Jew or court factor was a Jewish banker who handled the finances of or lent money to European, mainly German, royalty and nobility. In return for their services, court Jews gained social privileges, including, in some cases, being granted noble status. Court Jews were needed because prohibitions against usury applied to Christians but did not apply to Jews. Do we need to go any further? I mean, it was their loophole to bring in the Ashkenanis to pose to be, hey, look at me, we're really Jews. I guess they have no shame, and they were like, yeah, we'll call ourselves that for money.
Sure. Sell your soul much?
Yeah, so that's what I think it is. That's how they're fake.
Okay, let me take you a totally different direction. What's the fate of this Afghani president? What's going to happen to him?
That's probably Omar Sharif's grandson playing the part that he just, he'll pick up part playing the young Osama bin Laden on the TV series. Who knows?
Interesting.
Because, I mean, Osama bin Laden was on the CIA payroll. Everybody knows that. I mean, anymore for us, doesn't it just have to be laughable?
It is laughable.
It's kind of like, well, I'm going to hold on the plow until the end. Lord, am I going to get martyred or not here? Because, I mean, those are really the only two questions. Are we going to make it to see the light come down? the rescue from the beautiful city, or are we going to be one of those other ones that have to be like, whoop, there they go?
Funny you would mention cities, but it's not. I did notice one of the informational things going along the bottom of the video that you were playing for us said that the Taliban has entered the cities, and especially Kabul, and it's kind of right in your face that cities are maybe not the place to be. I don't think that means. What do you think that means, Alan?
Well, let me take it and see if it answers it while I try to address logic, copy, guess. Does India will take action against Taliban because India is powerful now and they have strict policy against terrorists? Well, logic, copy, I don't think so. Not at all. Why would India jump in and help at all when all of the money that we've paid to Pakistan over these last 20 years was basically refunneled for one purpose: harass India? So we've basically been funding Pakistan to harass India and ignore the borders that cross over into Afghanistan for 20 years. So no, I don't think India is going to waste its precious resources or young men as foolishly as they have in Iran and Iraq since, well, when was it that Saddam Hussein was marching the children armies across minefields? That was before 1992. That was with the Iran-Iraq war that I think Clinton and Bush and Reagan funded. They were all backing because Saddam Hussein was on the CIA payroll also. There are no good guys. They're all on there. But anybody that ever wants to get one of those machines that can test people's voices, and when they look in there and go, my name is Paco Allen, I have never been on the payroll of any government thing since I've left the United States Army, and I've renounced that vow, unless it's the dividend when I was on a jury one time. So no, I've never done it, and they'll be able to tell by that. And plus, when anybody decides to do a Freedom of Information Act on me and my dad, you'll know exactly what we've been up to all our lives. So let's check in on the news, man.
Hey, Alan, it was good talking to you. Good to see everybody. My battery is going low. Are you going to have a show this evening?
We probably will. And tell them it was super easy. All you got to do is click on the link and there you are, right?
StreamYard gave me grief 2 or 3 times, and then the third time was the charm. But actually, I think it was your music in the background that was messing up my stream.
Well, I'll talk to you soon. Adios, Amy Bobamy. Say hello to Terry, and you'll be in our prayers. Why Pakistan is supporting Taliban? No, they're not. It's just that they don't like the Hindu movement in India. It definitely is. Pakistan is not on friendly. It's a Islam Hindu thing, which is not as, we don't talk about it here, but they talk about it there. Check me out. You'll see.
If they finally look at the situation and say, wait a minute, we're paying the United States to lock up the energy supplies of South Central Asia and these pipeline routes that we're going to need for the next 100 years in the development of our economy, that's not going to work either. So the thing is that even if it's not a military issue, they don't send troops, let's say, into an area in order to seize it. It is a financial issue, and that's on the horizon.
And we'd also really like to remind people that we're in the 21st century, but what we're really living with is 19th century British colonial sort of leftover foreign policy that was picked up by the United States. It morphed into, and again, considering the attitude towards Russia, it just morphed into the 20th century became the Cold War.
Well, and I'd like to explore the transition from the 90s to what happened in the earlier part of this decade and how this is now playing out. We're all out of time, so we're going to have to do that in a subsequent interview. Your website, Invisible History, tell us about it.
InvisibleHistory.com, and in the book, there's a link to our publisher right on the website.
Alrighty, and I want to stress to listeners, we've only got about 2/3 of the way through the book. We haven't even gotten up to September 11th and the U.S. major involvement there. So as they say in old-time radio, stay tuned, because this concludes side 2 of For the Record program number 680, interview with Elizabeth Gould and Paul Fitzgerald. We've been talking with the authors of Invisible History, Afghanistan's Untold Story. Hello, my name is Dave Emery, and this is side 1 of For the Record program number in the world. Quote, Afghanistan has succeeded in what our international aid efforts urge every developing country to do. Afghanistan has gone into manufacturing and value-added operations. It now exports not opium, but heroin. Opium is converted into heroin on an industrial scale, not in kitchens, but in factories. Millions of the gallons of the chemicals needed for this process are shipped into Afghanistan by tanker. The tankers and bulk opium lorries on the way to factories share roads improved by American aid with NATO troops, unquote. How could this have happened on this scale, Murray asked. The answer is simple. The 4 largest players in the heroin business are all senior members of the Afghan government. The government that our soldiers are fighting and dying to protect, unquote. Murray's testimony might seem like a contradiction given Britain and America's much publicized efforts to destroy Afghanistan's opium crop, but a careful look at the operation reveals that the program targets largely Pashtun farmers in the south near Kandahar, stoking the flames of Pashtun anger, while inadvertently protecting northern warlords like General Rashid Dostum, who, as head of the Afghan armed forces, operates around the interdiction without interference. Murray writes, Dostum is an Uzbek, and heroin passes over the Friendship Bridge from Afghanistan to Uzbekistan, where it is taken over by President Islam Karimov's people. It is then shipped up the railway line in bales of cotton to St. Petersburg and Riga. The heroin jeeps run from General Dostum to President Karimov. The UK, United States, and Germany have all invested large sums in donating the most sophisticated detection and screening equipment to the Uzbek Customs Center at Termez to stop the heroin from coming through. But the convoys of jeeps running between Dostum and Karimov are simply waved around the side of the facility, unquote. That is not exactly, I think, what most of the people who designed this particular operation had in mind. So, again, sort of as the theme of the program and as the vehicle for expose, how did we get to this appalling state of affairs from where we were?
Well, you know, the issue, Dave, is that the situation today is much further along than anyone realizes. And it was established, of course, during the Secret War, beginning in the 1970s, 1973, when the Marxists took over in 1978 in Afghanistan. The Secret War intensified, and that just kind of that provided a kind of carte blanche, and a lot of the international groups. I mean, the French were very much involved in this. The French intelligence service and Alexandre Desmoranches. I believe we spoke about this in the last program a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But the French were known to support their covert operations in Indochina, with back in the 1950s, in the 40s and the 1950s. With the opium trade. That was very much an aspect of that, and it was very well known amongst the intelligence community and outside the intelligence community. But that sort of thing really had been, the United States really wasn't implicated at that point. The United States is the latecomer to this process, and certainly the darker side of this process. And so as the United States grew in importance in these areas, in Southeast Asia and South Central Asia, and these prime opium growing areas in the 1950s and 60s, the United States began to develop ways in which it involved itself in this. And at first, there were some people who were involved directly with the agency. And as a result of that, it became an embarrassment. You remember the church hearings back in the 1970s where all these dirty things that were going on were attributed to CIA covert actions. So what happened at the time was a lot of these things began to become privatized. And the Afghan War was a perfect example of the mating of a lot of these different interests in the Middle East and in Europe and in the United States to try to finance this covert war through Pakistan's ISI and the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, the BCCI, which was established by a Pakistani businessman. And so I'll read you from a book called The Outlaw Bank, just to give you an idea of, this is a book that was written a few years ago by Jonathan Beatty and S.C. Gwynn. We quote it in the book. Thus, the undertaking in Pakistan was planned as a hands-off operation for the CIA. Day-by-day contact with the Mujahideen would be left to the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence Agency. The United States could then deny any involvement. The CIA could supply the weapons and the money, weapons purchased from the third world countries, so they would not appear to have come from America, and untraceable cash money. Arrangements were also struck with China and Saudi Arabia. China agreed to sell the Mujahideen arms, and Saudi Arabia was to match U.S. financial contributions and send the funds through clandestine channels to the CIA, to the ISI, not the CIA. So this is the way it was set up originally. It was off the books. Now, if you ask people today at the CIA what was going on, they said, well, of course, we had no direct involvement with it, but we did know there was a drug problem. Milt Bearden, who ran the CIA operation in the 1980s from Pakistan, 1984 on, has admitted on camera that they were well aware that the drugs were going on. He said, but it wasn't really their mission to deal with that. I mean, that's their way of dealing with it. Jack Blum, who was the special counsel for the Kerry Committee investigating the narcotics in 1987, stated at one point that 12 metric tons were seized off the Makroon coast of Pakistan in 1987, 1988. That's the world supply for a year. Okay, now that was 22 years ago. They were putting out, this particular secret war was putting out that kind of amount of drugs. And what we're doing is, I mean, I just picked up the newspaper the other day here in Boston, and they've got two articles that were not related, but in the same newspaper. One was about the pure heroin that is coming into the city of Boston at this point. It's so pure that it can be snorted. It doesn't have to be injected. And the other thing was about the Kalashnikovs. Every time gangs busted in Boston now, the police are picking up scores of rounds, thousands of rounds of ammunition and Kalashnikovs, which have been imported, it said, from China and from Eastern Europe. So, you know, the war has come home. And it's, as I said, it's a lot further along than anyone realizes.
Elizabeth, some of the things that we talked about last time might be worth, I think, bringing up in terms of approaching how we got to that state of affairs, where basically the Afghan government and 4 senior officials of that government are acting as executives in industrial-style heroin production. Between the Soviet withdrawal and the events of September 11th and the U.S. Invasion into Afghanistan, you talked about the fossil fuels industry and various corporate interests that were sort of dining out on the United States. Why don't we recoup a little bit of that and then discuss Pakistan and the events of September 11th and how some of this actually led or overlaps those specific events, which of course triggered the U.S. invasion.
Well, I think that we really have to look at the entire events in Afghanistan really in light of a historical perspective. I mean, when you really do look at the way in which the drug trade really has been shown to wind itself through every one of these eras, epics, that we are really looking at a process that really, to end up with an Afghan government that basically is facilitating the largest, expansion of drug trade in Afghanistan, really should not be a surprise. That there was no way that anyone was going to be allowed to, take the political power for Afghanistan. Remember, back in 2001, when the Bonn conference took place, Hamid Karzai was really handpicked by the United States. And that, in fact, the warlords like Dostum were basically being invited right into the government. And that, so all the preconditions that really needed to be set up to guarantee that Karzai's government was going to facilitate this enhancement of the drug trade was inevitable. So I see this is one of the issues that concerns me.
Now, Is there anybody still in the chat room that just watched that? Because, ladies and gentlemen, that is an insurrection. That's what is an insurrection. Yeah, it's not for everybody. You go do your thing, Amy. I get it. Oh yeah, we're losing the war, Edna. The Taliban are taking over the capital in Afghanistan. The ones that after 9/11 we went in to stop. So now we've pulled out and we've left, the war in Iraq. And today we're losing the war in Afghanistan, and the Taliban are taking over the capital, sitting at the president's desk. Now, that's what a real insurrection looks like, everybody. And we're listening to somebody that described it of what was going to happen, and that it was all because of drugs and the mafia and crime.
About the way in which Karzai's government, which really, they talk about, a puppet. I mean, there's no way that the Karzai government could have ended up in any other situation when it came to the drug relationship. So this is part of the reason that we have to begin to look at these deep roots and understand that the kind of play. Now, when you do bring in Pakistan and you do bring in the agenda that Pakistan also had, I thought that this might be a quote that might help to establish how long ago, when we went out of our way to basically give President Zia the full power to determine who was going to get all the financing that was coming in through weapons and training and through Saudi Arabia or through the United States into Pakistan. This would have been back, in the 1980s. This was Felix Harrison, who was actually, he was he was a Washington Post correspondent. He was also one of the preeminent South Asia experts. And he's been on this issue, certainly in the Pakistan issue and the Afghan issue going way back. And he's spoken with many of the key players. And one of the people he interviewed was General Zia. And this is a quote that Felix Harrison made about his conversation. General Zia spoke to me about expanding Pakistan's sphere of influence to control Afghanistan, then Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and then Iran and Turkey, Harrison said. The design continues, he said. General Mohammed Aziz, who was involved in that Zia plan, has been elevated now to a key position by Chief Executive General Pervez Musharraf. So you see the handover that we're talking about in terms of the pan-Islamist movement, in terms of the deeper agendas that the United States through Zia was really signing on to. And again, the drugs really becomes the financial facilitator of this process. So we really have to begin to look at, the very tragic reality that foreign policy really is not what the front page of the news is telling us at all. That it really has more to do with these kinds of movements, which are using obviously the cover of things like, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. It was the greatest threat to peace since World War II, and we have to do something about it. What that inaugurated was a whole host of activities that really were inevitably going to be financed by the drug trade. And when you bring that up to 2001 and you look at the individuals that the United States really forced on the new Afghan government, the warlords like Dostum, who were really, it was a fait accompli. That part of what was going to be activated in that kind of configuration was the drug trade. And now we're looking at, of course, the fact that the Taliban, and again, when we have to remember the Taliban and its origins going back to Pakistani intelligence, with the idea of creating a Pakistani-friendly government in Afghanistan, is one of the major beneficiaries of the drug trade. So you're beginning, I think we're beginning to see that these are inevitable tie-ins.
I mean, as it was mentioned during the rule of the Mohawk in the 1980s, arrangement with the U.S. and the CIA. He set up Governor Fazl Haq of the Northwest Frontier Province to run this drug operation, and they created a trucking company known as the Logistics Cell to move the arms in and the drugs out. And a lot of this was going on during that time period, and it was reported in other media around the world. It was reported in Britain, it was reported in Canada, but we never got any of this story. In fact, at one point, we tried to, I stood up, we gave an event in 1981, the fall of 1981 in Boston, at a local hotel here, which was attended by a number of local and national media and international media. And the former U.S. ambassador to Afghanistan, who was then at the Tufts Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. He was the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. This was after our first trip, and we were presenting some of a look up in terms of what was actually going on inside Afghanistan. He stood up and said, "Who gave you permission to say this? Who gave you permission to do this?" And I told him, I said, I didn't realize as an American citizen I needed permission to do that sort of thing. There's no prohibition of going to Afghanistan. And he said, "Well, you're treading very closely to the line of the Soviet propagandists." So, I mean, this was the way. There was a chill in the room at that point. Now, this was a man who had been on McNeil Lira 2 or 3 days after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan with Richard Pipes, who had been the leader of Team D. The two of them had sat there and they said, "Oh, the Soviets are invading Afghanistan because they're getting ready to conquer Europe and the Persian Gulf." Okay, this was the official line. And what we were doing from the very beginning was trying to crack that official line. And boy, they were putting out the words very, very clearly that if you were going to cross that line and start saying what was really going on in Afghanistan, we're going to start calling you names. And so, so that was the chill that was put on the American media. And so as a result of that, I think a lot of what happened in the 1980s and why the story never got out about the drugs, about our relationship with Pakistan, about the development of Pakistan's nuclear weapons, about the support of terrorism in that part of the world. I mean, we're basically doing today what the Soviets were trying to do in 1979 and 1980, was to roll back terrorism in South Central Asia. And so none of that story ever got across to the American public. So it's very difficult today for our leaders, especially Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was instrumental in creating this particular paradigm in 1978 and 1979 at the National Security Council as American policy, which would be followed by the Reagan administration and expanded upon by the Reagan administration. It's very difficult for them to explain to the United States public, as you said, how did we get in this? What are we doing there? What is happening? The situation, of course.
Bill's going to take a
There's this one I want you to hear.
On and on and on there. Go to atgpress.com, click on Knowledge is Freedom, read the research articles of James Montgomery. There's a wealth of materials there, and they all are fantastic, in-depth. And guess what? They're all irrefutable. Trust me. You'll find out. You'll get the upset stomach. You'll get nauseated. You've been lied to, folks. The United States is still a British colony. And so this is the essay we are going to get into on the Ministry of Truth. Now, the reason I want to take a teacher and read this, I didn't plan next. I've been hearing people close to me, people I trust, people who are dear friends of mine, and brothers in the faith of Christ. Can't this be appealing to the Constitution, even though you've been told a number of times now by the legendary Visigoth and myself that the Constitution was a fraud, a total fraud. The founding fathers were lawyers, they were liars, they were frauds. They sold out
their own people. The United States, the colonies, never won the Revolutionary War. It was a backdoor Masonic deal to limit the battle damage, make it look like a war, and keep the profits going for England and for the wealthy, elitist, lawyerly families like the founding quote-unquote fathers in the colonies. And basically, the reason it appeared for so long that Americans had these rights and so-called rights and freedoms for so long, for a few decades anyway, after the Revolutionary War, it was mostly to do with geography, folks. It was not in the documents of the Constitution. Constitution does not apply to the common man, as we're about to find out. Not even the Declaration of Independence applied to the common man, as we are about to find out. And if you go back in history, things like even the Magna Carta, they're worthless documents. They're worth about the same as a toilet paper roll, the Magna Carta was. Completely worthless. James Montgomery will show you. He documents it. For one thing, this King John that was forced by the nobles in England to sign the Magna Carta. Well, the Pope immediately declared the Magna Carta null and void. And King John, by the way, a few years prior had given England to the Pope. So England was not King John's to give away to these barons, these noblemen, forcing at sword point the Magna Carta upon King John. And here, there you go. It's a document signed under duress. And even today, we know a document signed under duress is not a legal document. So the Magna Carta was worthless. Basically, folks, here it is in a nutshell. I hope I can get it down to that. Folks, common man, you have no rights except for those that Jesus Christ gave you as a saved soul, but he liberated your soul if you will take the sacrifice, take the opportunity he gave you. But your body is not going to have any actual rights until Jesus Christ returns and rules the earth with a rod of iron. Until then, everything you have that you think are rights, they are actually privileges. And that we are in slavery. We always have been. And it's remarkable that even people who get it, even people who are very close to me, who know that everything's a fraud around us, the whole world lies in a strong delusion that because of our sinful ways, God has given us over unto. And Satan loves deceiving the whole world. Revelation tells us that. He's got the whole world deluded to Satan. And everything on your mainstream news, flip it upside down if you want the truth. 9/11 was a fraud. The Oklahoma City bombings was a fraud. Korean airline 007 that was shot down in Russia was a fraud. Nothing. TWA 800 that was shot down off the coast of New Jersey, that was a fraud. Pearl Harbor, the Lusitania, the explosion of the Maine, the Gulf of Tonkin, on and on and on. The stock market crash, the Federal Reserve. Even people who know that all of those are frauds and the truth is almost completely reverse what mainstream news tells us, even those who get it and are Christian, even those, and they've been guests on my show, really except for Viz, they all still will hearken back occasionally to this Constitution as being somehow a fount of liberty for Americans, and they don't know that it's completely faulty. They should know better, basically, is what I'm trying to say, because the Constitution, you're still dealing there with man's law. It's weird. The propaganda you're fed in school about the founding fathers, the framers of the Constitution, it's like people who really get it, and already you're in rarefied company if you get it and you understand that history is a fraud. And then, if you understand that the Bible, that God's word is true, the real God's word. I mean, aren't very many people who do that, but once you get to that point, it's weird. Even those people will still latch on. They'll say, yeah, all history's been a fraud, basically. And the only thing we can trust is God's true word. However, there was this one time in history, this one completely atypical time, when you had a few honorable lawyers get together in colonial America and write this wonderful document to set mankind free. That was the one time when mankind became noble. The one time when no lawyers became noble. That was it, the one time. And they were, come on. Doesn't that right there, the picture I just painted, all of mankind's history, all of mankind's laws, it's all about tyranny, and profits is what it's really all about, profits. But there was this one time when that didn't apply. The U.S. Revolution, the Revolutionary War and the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, that was the one time where mankind became noble. Would stop and think about that. Would the Lord really allow that to happen? Allow there to be one time in history where elitist humans suddenly became not elitists and became truthful and told the truth and weren't about profits and wanted to rule a country not about profits, that weren't driven just by profits. They wanted to be truthful as God's word is truthful. Do you think God would really allow that to happen? No. All of mankind's history. And the Constitution, it set up a Calvinist republic. Oh, really? How many times does it mention Jesus Christ in the document? 0. Okay, how many times does the Declaration of Independence mention Jesus Christ? 0. Okay, but it mentions God and Lord. Well, gee, the founding framers were mostly Freemasons, and the Freemasons have their God and Lord, who is actually the ancient Baal deity, and they now call him the great architect of the universe. But it's no different than ancient Bel or Baal worship. It's just amazing. It's so frustrating. Well, anyway, that's why, belatedly, I'm telling you, I'm finally getting to the point. This is why I have to read you. Folks, you need to listen. If you have any faith in the Constitution, stop and listen to this, please. I took the trouble of doing my homework in this area. I took the trouble of spending my money on paper and ink, printing all of this up, voluminous essays from both the Informer and James Montgomery. It fills up half a bookshelf, half a long bookshelf in my office room that's running out of room. And I read them all, and I highlighted them all as I read. I made notes on them all. And I'm telling you, even if you just listen, stop what you're doing, and listen to just this one article by James Montgomery, you'll be totally convinced. It's irrefutable. The Constitution was a fraud. The founding framers were lawyers. They were frauds. The Declaration of Independence did not ever apply to the common American, you and me. It was a corporate deal, a Masonic corporate backdoor lawyer deal. And the United States is still a British colony. This was written in 1996 by James Montgomery. The trouble with history is We weren't there when it took place, and it can be changed to fit someone's belief and or traditions. Or it can be taught in the public schools to favor a political agenda and withhold many facts. I know you have been taught that we won the Revolutionary War and defeated the British, but I can prove to the contrary. I want you to read this paper with an open mind and allow yourself to be instructed with the following verifiable facts. You be the judge, and don't let prior conclusions on your part or incorrect teaching keep you from the truth. I, too, was always taught in school and in studying our history books that our freedom came from the Declaration of Independence and was secured by our winning the Revolutionary War. I'm going to discuss a few documents that are included at the end of this paper in the footnotes. The first document is the first charter of Virginia in 1606. See footnote 1. In the first paragraph, the King of England granted our forefathers license to settle and colonize America. The definition for license is as follows, from Bouvier's Law Dictionary, 1914, quote, in government regulation, authority to do some act or carry on some trade or business, in its nature lawful, but prohibited by statute, except with the permission of the civil authority, or which would otherwise be unlawful, unquote. Keep in mind, those that came to America from England were British subjects. So you can better understand what I'm going to tell you, here are the definitions for subject and citizen. Again, Bouvier's Law Dictionary, 1914, quote, in monarchical governments, by subject is meant one who owes permanent allegiance to the monarch, unquote. The following is from the 5th edition of Black's Law Dictionary, quote, constitutional law, one that owes allegiance to a sovereign and is governed by his laws. The natives of Great Britain are subjects of the British government. Men in free governments are subjects as well as citizens. As citizens, they enjoy rights and franchises. As subjects, they are bound to obey the laws. The term is little used in this sense in countries enjoying a republican form of government, unquote. I chose to give the definition for subject first, so you could better understand what definition of citizen is really being used in American law. Below is the definition of citizen from Roman law, from Bouvier's Law Dictionary, 1914. Quote, the term citizen was used in Rome to indicate the possession of private civil rights, including those accruing under the Roman family and inheritance law, and the Roman contract and property law. All other subjects were peregrines. But in the beginning of the 3rd century, the distinction was abolished, and all subjects were citizens, unquote. The king was making a commercial venture when he sent his subjects to America and used his money and resources to do so. I think you would admit the king had a lawful right to receive gain and prosper from his venture. In the Virginia Charter, he declares his sovereignty over the land and his subjects, and in paragraph 9, he declares the amount of gold, silver, silver, and copper he is to receive, if any is found by his subjects. There could have just as easily been none, or his subjects could have been killed by the Indians. This is why this was a valid right of the king. See Black's 4th edition, Jure Corde, quote, in the right of the crown, unquote. The king expended his resources with the risk of total loss. If you'll notice in paragraph 9, the king declares that all his heirs and successors were to also receive the same amount of gold, silver, and copper that he claimed with this charter. The gold that remained in the colonies was also the king's. He provided the remainder as a benefit for his subjects, which amounted to further use of his capital. You will see in this paper that not only is this valid, but it is still in effect today. If you will read the rest of the Virginia Charter, you will see that the king declared the right and exercised the power to regulate every aspect of commerce in his new colony. A license had to be granted for travel connected with transfer of goods, i.e. commerce, right down to the furniture they sat on. A great deal of the king's declared property was ceded to America in the Treaty of 1783. I want you to stay focused on the money and the commerce which was not ceded to America. This brings us to the Declaration of Independence. Our freedom was declared because the king did not fulfill his end of the covenant between king and subject. The main complaint was taxation without representation, which was reaffirmed in the early 1606 charter granted by the king. It was not a revolt over being subject to the King of England. Most wanted the protection and benefits provided by the king. Because of the king's refusal to hear their demands and grant relief, separation from England became the lesser of two evils. The cry of freedom and self-determination became the rallying cry for the colonists. The slogan, "Don't tread on me," was the standard borne by the militias. The Revolutionary War was fought and concluded when Cornwallis surrendered to Washington at Yorktown. As Americans, we have been taught that we defeated the king and won our freedom. The next document I will use is the Treaty of 1783, which will totally contradict our having won the Revolutionary War. See footnote 2. I want you to notice in the first paragraph that the king refers to himself as Prince of the Holy Roman Empire and of the United States. You know from this that the United States did not negotiate this treaty of peace in a position of strength and victory, but it is obvious that Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams negotiated a treaty of further granted privileges from the King of England. Keep this in mind as you study these documents. You also need to understand the players of those that negotiated this treaty. For the Americans, it was Benjamin Franklin, Esquire, a great patriot and standard bearer of freedom. Or was he? His title includes Esquire. An esquire, in the above usage, was a granted rank and title of nobility by the king, which is below knight and above a yeoman or common man. An esquire is someone that does not do manual labor as signified by this status. See the below definitions from Blackstone's commentaries, quote, esquires, by virtue of their offices as justices of the peace, and others who bear any office of trust under the crown, for whosoever studieth the laws of the realm, who studieth in the universities, who professeth the liberal sciences, and who can live idly and without manual labor, and will bear the port, charge, and countenance of a gentleman, he shall be called master, and he shall be taken for a gentleman, unquote. Following is from Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition, quote, esquire, in English law, a title of dignity next above gentleman and below knight. Also, a title of office given to sheriffs, sergeants, and barristers at law, justices of the peace, and others, unquote. Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, as you can read in the treaty, were all esquires, and were the signers of this treaty, and the only negotiators of the treaty. The representative of the king was David Hartley, Esquire. Benjamin Franklin was the main negotiator for the terms of the treaty. He spent most of the war traveling between England and France. The use of esquire declared his and the others' British subjection and loyalty to the crown. In the first article of the treaty, most of the king's claims to America are relinquished, except for his claim to continue receiving gold, silver, and copper as gain for his business venture. Article 3 gives Americans the right to fish the waters around the United States and its rivers. In Article 4, the United States agreed to pay all bona fide debts. If you will read my other papers on money, you will understand that the financiers were working with the king. Why else would he protect their interest with this treaty? Side note, boy, does that ever dovetail with the last book I just completed, The Babylonian Woe by David Astle, where Astle is always remarking on the shadowy powers, the truth that powers behind the throne. The money powers are always there in any civilization. They're the real powers, but you never see them, or you seldom see them. But the front man, whatever king or tyrant they put forth, will always look out for them, will always protect them. And here we go, the King of England protecting their interests in the Treaty of 1783. Okay. I wonder if you have seen the main and obvious point. This treaty was signed in 1783. The war was over in 1781. If the United States defeated England, how is the King of England granting rights to America when we were now supposedly his equal in status? We supposedly defeated him in the Revolutionary War. So why would these supposed patriot Americans sign such a treaty when they knew that this would void any sovereignty gained by the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War? If we had won the Revolutionary War, the king granting us our land would not be necessary. it would have been ours by his loss of the Revolutionary War. To not dictate the terms of a peace treaty in a position of strength after winning a war means the war was never won. Think of other wars we have won, such as when we defeated Japan. Did General MacArthur allow Japan to dictate to him the terms for surrender? No way. All these men, these quote-unquote founding fathers, all they did is gain status and privilege granted by the king and ensure the subjection of future unaware generations. Worst of all, they sold out those that gave their lives and property for the chance to be free. You know, that totally ties in today with the wars going on overseas, the wars for empire in Afghanistan and Iraq, who's largely, foolishly, pathetically sending their boys off to be, and now their girls, and now their daughters. How tragically, how insultingly, the ignorance, the shamefulness of it. But who's sending their children off to be cannon fodder nowadays? Oh, it's the patriotic Americans who call themselves Christians by and large, isn't it? Come on, you know you've met them. Come on, they got flags up on their cars, and they quote that they have a constitution that they've never read, and they got a Bible that they've never read, but boy, they're Christians and they're patriot Americans, aren't they? And they're sending their boys and now girls overseas to be cannon fodder. Well, guess what? You hear these stories in the Revolutionary War of, was it the Black Brigade? The preachers in the colonies who led up the militias and had called out the militias in the Minutemen to go fight the British. And they did a stellar job on the battlefield. What they did was totally brave. However, they were also completely sold out, and it accomplished nothing because they were sold out at the top. And so even you see back then, Christians picking up the sword, picking up the rifle to go and fight. And all it gets them is killed and sold out and taken advantage of back then. Because their leaders back then sold them out. And it's still happening today. Foolish Christians or people calling themselves Christians are fighting the battles of the oligarchs. They're fighting the battles of the enemy, of Satan. And yet they're Christian. At least calling themselves Christian. And maybe, I'm sure some of them, a lot of them are. Anyway, history doesn't change. Think of your redneck Christian over there fighting for democracy and liberty in Afghanistan. That's what you had fighting the revolution, the Revolutionary War then. Anyway, here we go. Back to the essay. When Cornwallis surrendered to Washington, he surrendered the battle, folks, but he did not surrender the war. Read the article of capitulation signed by Cornwallis at Yorktown. See footnote 3. Jonathan Williams recorded in his book Legions of Satan, printed in 1781, that Cornwallis revealed to Washington during his surrender that, quote, a holy war will now begin on America, and when it is ended, America will be supposedly the citadel of freedom, but her millions will unknowingly be subjects to the crown. In less than 200 years, the whole nation will be working for divine world government. That government that they believe to be divine will be the British Empire, unquote. Wow, was that really written in 1781? Apparently so, folks. All the treaty did was remove the United States as a liability and obligation of the king. He no longer had to ship material and money to support his subjects and colonies. At the same time, he retained financial subjection through debt owed after the treaty, which is still being created today, millions of dollars a day, and his heirs and successors are still reaping the benefit of the king's original venture. That, folks, that means that in the 1980s, when you saw that big extravagant wedding on all the channels in America of Princess Di's wedding to Prince Charles, I hope you enjoyed that because we paid for it. You paid for it, folks. Yes, we'll get to that. We'll get to the proof on that. If you will read the following quote from Title 26, you will see just one situation where the king is still collecting a tax from those that receive a benefit from him on property which is purchased with the money the king supplies at almost the same percentage. Oh boy. Next up is some IRS legalese. Should I get into that? Let's get into a little bit. Cite 26 USC section 1491. Head section 1491, imposition of tax. Statute. There is hereby imposed on the transfer of property by a citizen or a resident of the United States, or by a domestic corporation or partnership, or by an estate or trust which is not a foreign estate or trust, to a foreign corporation as paid in surplus, or as a contribution to capital, or to a foreign estate or trust, or to a foreign partnership, an excise tax equal to 35% of the excess of 1, the fair market value of the property so transferred, over 2, the sum of A, the adjustment basis for determining gain of such property in the hands of the transferor, plus B, the amount of the gain recognized to the transferor at the time of the transfer, source, yada yada yada, amendments, yada yada yada, all these legalese. Oh boy. This is it, man. This is why Jesus condemned these people. Writing this parallel, bizarro world language that only they can, and the preservation of which the future strength and security of the country must forever depend, unquote. The determined language of this speech, pointing to the continuance of the American war, was echoed back by a majority of both Lords and Commons. In a few days after, on December 12th, it was moved in the House of Commons that a resolution should be adopted declaring it to be their opinion, quote, that all further attempts to reduce the Americans to obedience by force would be ineffectual and injurious to the true interests of Great Britain, unquote. The rest of the debate can be found in footnote 4. What were the true interests of the king? The gold, silver, and copper. The new war was to be fought without Americans being aware that a war was even being waged. It was to be fought by subterfuge and key personnel being placed in key positions. The first 2 parts of my other essay, A Country Defeated in Victory, that's another great essay James Montgomery wrote, A Country Defeated in Victory, it's about the Revolutionary War, go into detail about how this was done and exposes some of the main players. Every time you pay a tax, you are transferring your labor to the king, and his heirs and successors are still receiving interest from the original American charters. The following is the definition of tribute or tax, quote, a contribution which is raised by a prince or sovereign from his subjects to sustain the expenses of the state, a sum of money paid by an inferior sovereign or state to a superior potentate to secure the friendship or protection of the latter, unquote. This is from Black's Law Dictionary, 4th edition. As further evidence, not that any is needed, a percentage of taxes that are paid are to enrich the King or Queen of England. For those that study Title 26, you will recognize IMF, which means Individual Master File. All taxpayers have one. To receive one, you have to be able to break their codes using File 6209, which is about 467 pages. On your IMF, you will find a blocking series which tells you what type of tax you are paying. You will probably find a 300 to 399 blocking series, which 6209 says is reserved. You then look up the BMF 300 to 399, which is the Business Master File in 6209. You would have seen
Recent developments have seen the jazz world split in two by a new wave of musicians calling themselves disc jockeys. Those in favour describe the phenomena as a fresh rush of blood in the aging corpse of music. Those against prefer the term Emperor's New Clothes. Tonight you may judge for yourselves as we bring you the Propeller Heads, who together with the legendary Shirley Bassey play their arrangement, History Repeating.
What is about is something evolving. Whatever may come, the world keeps revolving. They say the next big thing is here, that the revolution's near. But to me it seems quite clear that it's all just a little bit of history repeating. Just be a shout and your style is growing. But it don't know if it's coming or going. There is action, there is that. Some is good, some is bad. And the truth is to understand that it's all just a little bit of history. Some people dance if they don't know singing. When I'm your head, it's your hips that I'm swinging. I try to enjoy woman, man, girl and boy. Feel the pain, feel the joy. It's accept the little bits of history repeating. Just a little bit of history
Well, what can I say? It's different.
But not that different. Yeah, I thought I was sharing the screen. But you got the general mist of it's all just a little bit of history repeating, I hope. Because that's what it is, right? We've seen it before, and now we know. There is no bombs that are going to destroy this world. This is a judgment from God. And mud flood was Armageddon. It's a flat earth nation. You know, I'm never going to tell you anything else. Why would I? Even on a day when we're losing a war after 20 years, I still have your best interest at heart. Amen. Hallelujah.